All right. One, two, one, two. Okay. Everything doth seem to be in order. All right. So, hello everybody. My name is Zed, and welcome back to TCG Card Shop Simulator. So, last we left off, I opened up a card shop and spent the past 11 days setting up everything I'd like. And today, my goal is to expand the shop. And hopefully I can expand it like an entire section all the way to this side right here. Get up more shelves and tables and all that, and yeah, get a proper card shop going. And just like last time, I had the dual logs playing in the background. So yeah, I'll go ahead and keep on doing that just for a little bit of background noise. And I will be continuing from the last video we left off on, which I think was the 5+ hours of classic Yu-Gi-Oh cards. So once I go ahead and get that video set up, we'll go ahead and continue on with the shop.
In this video, we're looking at some of the earliest sets of the game, more specifically Pharaonic Guardian and
All
Magician's
right,
Force, and going over 10
let's
of the
go.
worst cards from these early parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 10, we have Great Dizard. This is a level 6 monster with 1900 attack, which has the effect that it gains effects based on the amount of monsters destroyed by battle. Where if it destroys one monster by battle, it now has the effect where any spell or trap card that targets it has their effect
I think I still
negated
have
if
my
it's destroyed. If
copy
you
of
destroy
Great
two
Dizard
monsters, you can
somewhere.
tribute this card during your main phase in order to special summon Fushio Richie from your hand or deck. Now, what's
Hmm.
really unique about this card is it's one of, if not the only monster in the game, which gains effects based on the amount of monsters destroyed by battle. Where usually destroying monsters by battle is a trigger in order to activate a singular effect, like with Fire Dog bringing out a fire monster with 200 defense every time you destroy something by battle. There's also a Blackluster Link monster, which has 3 different effects that can activate each
Oh
time it
wow,
destroys a monster by
Blackluster's
battle,
made it into
which is still
the
unique for
Link
this card's
era.
requirement of
Nice.
destroying specific amounts for different effects. Where obviously you're trying to destroy up to 2 monsters, so you can use his ability to special summon the boss monster from the deck. Although Fushio Richie is not that great of a card either. Fushio Richie is a level 7 monster with 2600 attack, which has the effect where it can't be normal summoned or set and must be special summoned by Great Dizard. It also has an
Ooh, that's
effect where it can
bad.
special summon any zombie monster from your graveyard, although the trigger for this is that it must be flip face up, which is kind of a weird requirement for a monster that can only be special summoned, and especially for one that has kind of a difficult summon requirement in the first place. It does, however, have an effect that lets you change it to face down defense position once per turn, so you can eventually use the ability to special summon a zombie from your graveyard. Additionally, it also has
Eventually.
protection, where it negates and destroys spell or trap cards that target it, just like the first effect of Great Dizard. Now, a little side note about this card. Its Japanese name is actually Nosferatu Lich, so it's really weird that it was given such an incredibly different name in the TCG. Anyways, for a monster that requires
Probably
2
because of
battle phases of
localization.
setup on a 1 tribute monster, the payoff is having to wait an additional turn for the card to flip itself face down, and then back up in order to maybe special summon a zombie from the graveyard. Now, being able to
Which
special summon a
is,
zombie from the
yeah,
graveyard
it's not
is
worth
good,
it.
but not good enough to be worth all the investment required. The only reason Great Dizard is only at number 10 on this list is because at least the effect is somewhat unique, and the protection it gets is pretty decent as well, since this is a set that introduced cards like Raigeki Break, which could target and destroy it, which it can become immune to. Although even in the early time
Raigeki
period
Break
this
is
card's
good.
release, slowly tribute summon a monster with only 1900 attack was not very good, so it saw all of no competitive play. And at number 9, we have Cobra Man Sakuzi. This is a level 3 monster with 1400 defense, which has the effect when it's flipped face up, you can look at all of your opponent's face down spell or trap cards. And also,
And
once
that's
per
it.
turn, you can change it to face down defense position. Now, the set this card came out in had the theme of cards being able to put themselves back face down, and then having effects whenever they're flipped face up, like Fujio Richie. And while some of them were pretty decent effects, some of them were like Cobra Man and had
Like the
absolutely
scarabs.
mediocre effects, which technically were positive. It also had pretty mediocre stats at only 800 attack and 1400 defense, which wasn't
Oof.
really enough to push any kind of big damage or survive the beaters of the day. Its typing and attribute weren't anything special at the time either, so it was basically just pack filler. And at number 8, we have Pharaoh's Treasure. This is a trap card with a rather unique effect, where
Oh,
when
I
you
have this
activate it,
one.
you shuffle it back into your deck face up. Then, when you draw this card that was face up, you get to add 1 card from your graveyard to your hand, then you send this card from your hand to the graveyard. So basically, it allows you to add any card in your graveyard back to your hand. which technically is a very good effect. They
It
don't really
is.
have cards in the game which allow you to add any card in your graveyard back to your hand, so there obviously had to be some kind of cost for this. Especially since this direct one-for-one trading doesn't lose you card advantage, like you normally do for effects like this, like with Boogie Trap or Magical Stone Excavation. However, the fact that you do have to put this card face up into your deck and then draw it later is kind of a very hard condition to fulfill. This
Yeah.
effect can be considered a quest condition, where you have to wait a few turns and then maybe even try to do something special in order to increase your chances of getting it for the payoff of the actual effect. And for all of the payoff of having to actually resolve the card, simply recurring one card from your graveyard is honestly not that good. If the card lets you search out a card from your deck instead, even that might not be good enough. Did you know we have a card in the game called Sales Pitch, which is a trap card that allows you to search out any card from your deck under the condition that your opponent adds a card from the deck to their hand outside of drawing? You know, the same conditions as activating Ash Blossom, one of the most played cards in the game. Well, Sales Pitch sees absolutely no competitive play, and that's because the condition is just hard enough, and the restriction of the card where you can't use the card you add to your hand that turn you use it, plus it being a trap card, means it's just too slow for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pharaoh's Treasure is kind of like the old school version of Sales Pitch, just too slow, even if technically it has really good effects, because there were
The
very
speed of that
powerful
card
cards
is
that you
just,
want to get back
it
from
makes
your
it
graveyard.
obsolete.
And at number 7, we have Kishido Spirit. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where monsters on your side of the field cannot be destroyed by battle if they have the same exact attack as your opponent's monster. Normally in Yu-Gi-Oh! If two monsters have the exact same attack in battle, they both get destroyed as a result of that battle, unless those attacks are 0. So this card basically gives you a very limited amount of battle immunity, and with how many stable monster cards people would share amongst their decks, chances are there was an opportunity for this card's effect to actually come into play. However, this card is kind of like Cobra Man, in that it's technically a beneficial effect, just not good enough to take a spot in your deck. It's more like an incredibly mediocre effect that doesn't do anywhere near enough to justify a spot in your deck, or one of your precious 5 card draws. In fact, this card is one of the trash items they give to players in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, as one of the few common cards they hand out like candy every time you randomly get cards from events.
Wow.
And at number 6, we have 8 Claw Scorpion. This is a level 2 insect monster which has the effect where it can put itself face down once per turn, just like a lot of the other cards from the set.
And is that it?
It also has the effect while it's on the field that if it attacks a face down defense position monster, its attack becomes 2400 during damage calculation only. Now, being able to have 2400 attack when attacking a face down defense position monster is actually not half bad for a low-level monster. The problem is that it's not good enough, especially for how low all of its stats are. Even if you can use this card to attack into an opponent's defense position monster, nearly guarantee that it's destroyed with its high attack, then putting it face down during the main phase 2 so it's not vulnerable to life point damage, it's still not really worth it because it only has 200 defense, and anything that's like
it's
on it can destroy
pretty
that
weak.
as well. If this effect was tied to a monster that had more defense points, i.e. like 2000 defense, then it might have been a useful effect because it could actually survive battles. But since the stats are so low, and its attacking effect only works on face down defense position monsters, which were never really high priority targets even in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Anyway, it's kind of a decent effect tied to a too weak body, which actually makes it kind of bad. And at number 5, we have Pyro Clock of Destiny. This is a trap card which has the effect where you can advance the turn count by 1, which basically means if a card has an effect which counts a turn as part of its conditions, then you can add +1 to it. So something like
And that's
Sword
about
of
it.
Golden Light or Final Countdown. And this effect is completely unique. There are no other cards that have this kind of effect in the game. And if you're able to somehow loop the effect of Pyro Clock of Destiny over and over, it used to be able to win on the very first turn of the game with Final Countdown. Although they
That's
have
crazy.
since nerfed all the cards that did allow to activate trap cards as many times as you want per turn, so it's not really anything that's possible anymore in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! So the only really useful application of Pyro Clock of Destiny is to win 1 turn earlier with Final Countdown. However, Final Countdown decks historically just try to stall for as long as possible, and would value cards that allow them to stall further over using Pyro Clock of Destiny, since being able to stall your opponent out of 1 turn gives you 2 counts on Final Countdown, whereas Pyro Clock only gives you 1. So it's never really seen any competitive play, even though Final Countdown has seen a lot of competitive play over the years. And since it's not really beneficial to any of the other very few cards where it actually works on them, it's just not a very good card in general, despite how completely unique the effect is. And at number 4, we have Senri-Eye. This is a continuous
what was
spell
this one
card
again?
where, once per turn, during each of your standby phases, you can look at the top card of your opponent's deck by paying 100 life points. So, basically,
that's it.
only gives you knowledge
Oh,
of the
that's
top
not
card of
good.
your opponent's deck, and didn't actually let you do anything with it. It was also only usable during your standby phase, which meant when you activated the card, you wouldn't get any benefit from it until your next turn. And on top of that, it even had a life point cost for some reason, even if it was an incredibly minor one. Now, technically, gaining information of the top card of your opponent's deck is beneficial, especially if
But
you're
at the
trying to
cost
create
of
effects
100
like
life
a
points each
inscription,
time only
where
during
the
your
card lets you look
turn?
at the top of your opponent's
Ugh.
deck, and if it's a monster, you can special summon it to your side of the field. But if it's a spell or trap card, it gets into your opponent's hand instead. So if you wanted to set up a 2-card combo in order to try to find out if you can actually summon the card with conscription, then obviously Senri Eye is a beneficial effect. However, in this case, if you look at the top card of your opponent's deck and it's not a monster, then you just kind of have to wait until your next turn to look at another card, because it didn't let you do anything with the top card of the deck. If it allowed you to look at the top 3 cards and then rearrange them in whatever order you wanted, that actually might be a good effect. Or if you could just look at the top card and choose to put it on the bottom of the deck, that would be better too, but still not worth the cost that it has. So obviously, not being able to do anything with it kind of bumps this card down to the almost useless tier. And at number 3, we have Armor Exe. This is a level 4 rock monster with 2400 attack, which has nothing but negative effects to account for its very high attack stat for its low level. As a reminder, this time period, the highest attack for level 4 lower monsters was around 1900. So cards rarely
And then
went
anything above that would have negative effects.
And the negative effect this card had was that it could not attack during the same turn that it was summoned. And during each of your standby phases, it had a maintenance cost where you had to remove 1 spell counter on your side of the field, otherwise destroy this card. Now, there have been plenty of cards with high attacks and downsides that have seen competitive play over the years, like Goblin Attack Force or Zombie of the Dark. However, one thing each of these 2 cards had over Armor Exe was that you could completely ignore the downsides if you played a Skill Drain deck. Skill Drain is a floodgate which negates the effects of all
I never
monsters on
thought
the
of
field,
that.
and combos incredibly well with monsters with high attack and negative effects, except with Armor Exe. This card is one of the few high attack level 4 monsters which can't effectively play under Skill Drain, and that's because you can't negate costs. And because you can't negate this card's cost, once your next standby phase rolls around, it would destroy itself unless you were actually able to pay a spell counter for it. And if you were trying to play it pure, it was also pretty bad because it couldn't even attack on the first turn it was brought out. So you'd have to pay the maintenance cost.
So it had
a
summoning
time before
sickness.
you're able to use it normally.
Yeah,
And
that's
all
bad.
of this just led to the card being one of the few high attack level 4 monsters with negative effects that never saw any kind of play, because it was bad in decks that wanted to use cards like these, and it was bad in decks that played spell counters. Because funny thing about early Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell counters, they were very hard to get on the field in the first place. Having to remove 1 spell counter from your side of the field was a legitimate difficult cost to pay, because spell counters were generally only created and then used immediately by one-time effects, like Breaker the Magical Warrior. They did have other cards that could generate spell counters, but they weren't very good. And the only spell counter cards that actually saw play were ones that would use their spell counters immediately. So there generally weren't a lot of spell counters lying around to pay the cost for Armor Exe, as the card itself couldn't even hold spell counters. And you can't play spell counters on cards unless they have an effect that specifically allows you to, unlike pretty much every other counter in the game. Although I should specify, this isn't because spell counters are ruled differently or anything. It's just pretty much every card that has to do with spell counters specifically says that they can hold them or not. And cards that play spell
And
counters
each of them would
specifically
have
has
like a
the card
max
has
they can
text,
hold.
which says that you can hold them. Which means you wouldn't be able to use something like Spell Power Grass to put a spell counter in Armor Exe, since it technically doesn't have the effect to hold them, even if it has the maintenance cost to use them. Also, just a side note, Armor Exe is one of the few cards that was given a pronunciation guide on how to say its name as Exe, but it was given out in one of its rulings randomly, funnily enough. And at number 2, we have Card Shuffle. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect where you can pay 300 life points in order to shuffle either yours or your opponent's deck. Additionally, this effect is once per turn. Now, to be able to shuffle yours or your opponent's deck does technically have beneficial applications. Like, for example, if you look at the top card of your opponent's deck with Senri Eye and you don't want your opponent to add that card to their hand, you could use Card Shuffle in order to make sure that card is no longer on the top of your opponent's deck. Or if you use some kind of effect in order to stack the top card of your deck, where
at this point, Card Shuffle just gets a little bit technical.
Back on top of your deck with Plague Spreader Zombie as a cost, you can then shuffle your deck in order to make sure you don't draw into that card. However, none of these cases are worth using a whole card slot in your deck for, when you could instead just play something like Raigeki to destroy all your opponent's monsters, or a Pot of Greed to draw more cards, etc, etc. There's just better staples you can use instead of using one of your slots for Card Shuffle. In fact, the effect is so unimpressive, they even added as a skill to Duel Links where you don't even have to have the card in your deck in order to gain the effect, and it's still bad. Because even if you don't lose card advantage for the effect, it's still not beneficial enough to play it over any other skill in the game, except for decks that specifically just need to pay 300 life points for some reason. And also, since it's once per turn, you can't even use it in order to adjust your life points by constantly shuffling your deck and paying 300 over and over, whereas cards like Inspection did have this niche before they nerfed the card so you can no longer use its effect multiple times per turn. And finally, at number 1, we have the Great Phantom Thief. This is a level 3 monster with 1000 attack, which has the effect where, if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you get to declare one card name. Then you get to look at your opponent's hand, and if your opponent has any cards in their hand with that declared name, you get to send them all to the graveyard. Now, the ability to discard from your opponent's hand is actually one of the strongest effects in the game, specifically because it's so rare.
But with it
most
being a
cards which
monster
can
card,
allow
it
you to
just seems
discard
kind
from
of
your opponent's
pointless.
hand have had very tough activation requirement, and being able to successfully deal battle damage to your opponent with a low attack monster like Great Phantom Thief should warrant the effect of being able to discard from your opponent's hand. The problem with this card is that you have to know what's in your opponent's hand first in order to be able to pull off the effect.
Yep.
At the same time period, there were cards like White Magical Hat, Don Zalug, and Spirit Reaper, which all had the effect where if they successfully inflicted damage to your opponent's life points, you could discard one random card from your opponent's hand. And these effects were actually good and saw competitive play in early Yu-Gi-Oh! And there have been a lot of other cards printed since then which do similar things. So, the Great Phantom Thief not only has the exact same conditions as these other, more guaranteed effects, but
It's
they
just
are
worse.
effects already balanced by the fact that it's hard to pull this off in the first place. You then have to jump through the extra hurdle of knowing what cards are in your opponent's hand in order to get a discard from this one card. However, if you're lucky and you know what cards on your opponent's hand, and they have multiple of those cards in their hand, then Great Phantom Thief can potentially discard more than one card. However, with how hard it is to get off the activation requirement in the first place, adding extra hurdles on top of
There's
this
just no
event, it
point in
makes
having
the
that card.
bad. And there was no reason to play it when you just had the other 3 cards in the game instead. However, if you had 2 copies of Great Phantom Thief on the field, you could use the first one to attack in order to use the effect to check your opponent's hand, and then use the second one in order to actually be able to declare a card in their hand to discard. Although in this same scenario, if you just had 2 White Magical Hats, you could just discard 2 cards in their hand instead, guaranteed. So an effect that seems pretty decent on service level actually becomes kind of bad when compared to its competition, which can do the exact same thing but easier, but were also hard to activate as well. In this video, we're going to go over some of the worst cards from the Dark Crisis pack, one of the earliest sets of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is a pack full of terrible cards even by early Yu-Gi-Oh! Standards.
Ooh, this will be fun.
We have Maju Garzette. This is a level 7
yep,
monster
I had
with
that one.
For attack, where its attack becomes equal to the combined original attack of the 2 monsters used for its tribute summon. Now, the effect of this card seems like it might not be half bad. If you had 2 high attack monsters in the field, you could simply tribute both of them to bring out this one card. You would have a very beefy beat stick that your opponent would have a hard time beating over.
But
in the same set that released this card, they also released a card called Great Maju Garzette, which is a level 6 monster that has the effect where its attack becomes equal to twice the original attack of the monster used for its tribute summon, which is a much better effect.
yes,
The reason for that is the amount of resources in order to bring out both of them, plus the attack power values. For example, if you have 2 Summon Skulls on your side of the field, both with 2500 attack, and you tribute them both to bring out Maju Garzette, you now have 1 monster with 5000 attack on the field. However, in the same exact previous board state, if you instead tribute one of them for Great Maju Garzette, you'll have a monster with 5000 attack and a 2500 attack Summon Skull left, which is just more value overall. And in fact, Great Maju Garzette was such a good card at being a great beat stick, it actually saw some competitive play. Whereas Maju Garzette was so bad, it was purely pack filler. However, even though its effect is not that great, it's still probably better than the other cards on this list, mainly because the effect is only really bad in comparison to its much better level 6 counterpart. And at number 9, we have Rod of the Mind's Eye. This is an equipped spell card which has the effect that any damage the equipped monster deals becomes 1000 points. So, for example, if you attack directly with something like Drill Barnacle, instead of doing 300 points of damage, it would instead deal 1000. Also, if a monster has more than 1000 attack, it does the same and lowers it to only 1000. Now, this effect is kind of mediocre. Even in this time period, they had cards like Mage Power, United We Stand, 2 cards which would give a monster well over 2000 attack points for a single equip. So making it so monsters only do 1000 points of damage was kind of an incredibly minor effect that wasn't worth using. Specifically with an equipped spell card though, because later on they did create a retrain of this card in the form of a field spell called the Temple of the Mind's Eye, which basically applies the effect of the equipped spell to all monsters on the field, where no matter how much battle damage they deal, it always becomes 1000. This was actually
that seems so much better.
Useful in stall decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, because with only 4000 life points and only 3 field zones, it meant if you had this field spell card out, it was impossible for your opponent to OTK you, giving you time to regain your life points and just stabilize in some other way. And it also synergized pretty well with the backup squad, that allowed you to draw 1 card for every 1000 points of damage you took, which you were guaranteed to take exactly 1000 points
because of the field spell
of Temple of Mind's Eye. However, even though the effect was useful, it wasn't useful if it was only on equipped spell card given to a single monster on your side of the field, and was more useful on your opponent's monsters from doing too much damage to you, and only really
that sounds about right.
3 field zones. And at number 8, we have Battle Scarred. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect where you select one of your Arcfiend monsters. Then, each time you would pay life points during your standby phase for the monster's maintenance costs, your opponent also pays the same amount of life points. Now, the original line of Archfiend monsters added in this set could all also probably make this list, since they were infamously
Yeah, the
bad.
Archfiend
They
was
all
a
had fewer
weird
attack points,
archetype.
they had maintenance costs during your standby phase, and the effects of the cards were incredibly minor. Dark Bishop Archfiend, for example, only has 300 attack and has an effect where if an Archfiend monster on your side of the field is targeted for a card effect, you can roll a 6-sided die. And if the result is 1, 3, or 6, you get to negate and destroy that card. However, all of the other first-gen Archfiend monsters also had a similar effective target protection, so granting it to another Archfiend monster wasn't super necessary, especially on such a weak body that required a maintenance cost and couldn't even special summon itself. Viopon Archfiend also had a 500 life point maintenance cost, could negate on a roll of a 3 that targeted it, and only had the effect where your opponent could only attack this card instead of your other Archfiend monsters. And with only a
that's
paltry
not good.
1200 attack and no way to special summon itself, was kind of useless. Infernal Queen Archfiend could negate on a roll of a 2 or a 5 that targeted it, only had 900 attack, and had the effect to increase the attack of one Archfiend monster by 1000 points until the end phase during the standby phase.
And that's
So,
it.
you wouldn't even be able to gain the attack until your opponent's turn rolled around, or if you somehow survived until your next turn, where it could maybe become a 1900 attack beatstick. Probably the most useful card was Shadow Knight Archfiend, which had an impressive 2000 stat line for a level 4 monster, where it can negate card effects that target it if it rolled a 3, had a 900 life point maintenance cost, the largest of all the other Archfiend monsters, and had a negative effect where it dealt half battle damage to your opponent. And again, none of these cards could special summon themselves. They were all incredibly weak besides Shadow Knight and Terror King, and the support cards weren't super good, especially when you had stuff like Battle Scar that just made your opponent also pay your maintenance costs with you. So if you equipped it as Shadow Knight Archfiend, which paid 900 life points, the largest amount out of all of them, that meant you could basically burn 900 damage to your opponent every standby phase, but didn't even prevent you from taking the damage yourself. And while 900 damage every turn from one card is decent for continuous trap burn damage, it's not from one card. It's a 2-card combo that can be interrupted from either of them being destroyed. And at that point, it's definitely not worth the effort to use it, because there's plenty of other burn strategies to use that
I can
don't
see it
involve
just
using
takes too
one of
much
the worst
work.
initial archetypes ever made, because the rest of the archetype had nothing to do with burn damage either. And at number 7, we have Agido. This is a level 4 fairy monster, which has the effect that if it's destroyed by battle specifically, you can roll a 6-sided die. Then, based on the result you get, you can special summon a fairy-type monster from your graveyard whose level is exactly equal to the number rolled. Or if it was 6, you can special summon a level 6 or higher fairy monster from your graveyard. Now, the problem with this card is that most people who play decks full of monsters generally play monsters of a single type of level, not a whole variety of levels. So if you're playing a whole bunch of level 4 fairy monsters, Agido would only have a positive effect if you rolled exactly a 4, which is a very low 1 in 6 chance. However, even if Agido was able to special summon a monster regardless of its dice roll, it still wouldn't be that useful because of all the other recruiters that existed in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, which for the same condition could special summon a monster from your deck. The obvious bonus of this card was a chance to maybe summon a high-level monster from your graveyard, which isn't really worth the amount of effort required to do that. Since you need to get the high-level fairy monster in the graveyard, you have to make sure Agido is destroyed specifically by battle, and then you have to roll a 6 on a dice roll, which is way too much effort for trying to special summon a high-level monster. They did, however,
it's not worth
retrain
it.
this card in the modern era with a much better effect, where if this card is sent from your hand or deck to the graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of both players' decks to the graveyard. Then, if you have Exchange Spirit in the grave,
can
you can
mill.
send another 5 more cards from either player's deck to the graveyard. Additionally, if it's in your hand, it has a hand effect, which is more similar to its old school effect, where if cards are sent from the hand or deck to either player's graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand, then special summon a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard as well, except another copy of itself. If Agido had its new effect back in the day, it might have actually seen competitive play because of how useful milling your deck was even in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Not even counting the effect of being able to special summon a monster from the graveyard with its hand effect, something that was incredibly rare back then. And at number 6, we have Dark Scorpion Gorg the Strong. This is a level 5 monster which has the effect that if it inflicts battle damage to your opponent, you can activate one of its 2 effects, where you can either return one of your opponent's monsters to the top of their deck, which is one of the best forms of removal I might add, or send the top card of their deck to the graveyard, which is an incredibly minor effect. So, if you manage to actually inflict battle damage with this card, you did get a really good removal effect, or incredibly minor mill effect. However, here are the problems with this card. For
It
one,
needs a
it's
tribute
level 5
summon.
monster with only 1800 attack. At this point in time, we had terrible archetypes like Archfiend monsters with 2000 attack on a level 4 monster. So a lot of high attack, low level monsters could just beat over this card. And since its condition for getting its effect off was to deal battle damage, that was kind of a problem. So if your opponent only
Big
had monsters
problem.
with more than 1800 attack on the side of the field, you wouldn't be able to use the effect of this card, which under best case scenario would allow you to remove some of your opponent's monsters. So it had a monster removal effect that was reliant on it being able to deal damage, which just it wasn't very good at, because it was hard to bring out and had such low stats. So the amount of resources that would be required in order to both get this card on the field and buff it up enough so it can attack over something or attack directly would not be worth only being able to return one of your opponent's cards to the top of their deck. For the same amount of effort, you could just use Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, which on a trap card they could just use during your opponent's turn to disrupt their plays, also performing the same effect for a simple discard from your hand, and did see
Yeah,
tons of
that
competitive play
does
because
sound
it
much
was really
better.
good. However, Gorg the Strong never saw any competitive play, even if some of the other Dark Scorpions did, which was another archetype pretty infamous for being really bad. And at number 5, we have Ray of Hope. This is a trap card which allows you to shuffle 2 light monsters from your graveyard back into the deck. Now, I will say, there is some merit to shuffling your own monsters back into your deck, as shown with the Ishizu Shufflers, or even the Transmigration Prophecy, which was a trap card that returned 2 cards from either graveyard back into the deck. It was on the limited list for years. However, a key difference between these cards is the versatility in how many cards are able to be shuffled back and from where. The Transmigration Prophecy and the Ishizu Shufflers can target cards from both players' graveyards, which allows you to both recur resources if you need to, and more importantly, disrupt your opponent's graveyard from their graveyard effects. However, Ray of Hope only allows you to choose cards from your graveyard, and only specifically light monsters, which
Yeah,
narrows the
so
scope
there's a
of its
big
usability
limitation.
considerably. And there wasn't really any light monster support released in this set, as the Chaos Monsters weren't released until the very next set, and Light Swords wouldn't come out until years later. So Ray of Hope was just kind of a random card that didn't really have any merit, because you couldn't use it to disrupt your opponent as a modular option, and its only effect wasn't very beneficial to any strategy that existed at the time. And for the light monsters it did exist for, namely the recruiters like Shining Angel perhaps, it wasn't the best use of one of your 1 cards in your deck. And at number 4, we have Dark Flare Knight. This is a fusion monster which requires a Dark Magician and a Flame Swordsman as its 2 materials, and has
Oh,
the
I
effect
remember this
where
one.
you take no battle damage from battles involving this card. And if it's destroyed by battle specifically, you get to special summon 1 Mirage Knight from your hand or deck. And Mirage Knight is a 2800 attack monster that can only be summoned by the effect of Dark Flare Knight, and basically has the effect where if it attacks a monster, it gains attack equal to the attack of its target.
So that
However,
is
during the
very
end phase in which this card
specific.
was involved in a battle, it's banished. So, the intended synergy with Dark Flare Knight was to bring it out, crash into one of your opponent's monsters so it dies, then bring up Mirage Knight from your deck so you can finish the job of actually crashing over whatever you wanted to for a lot of damage. However, there's a couple of problems with this intended
But again,
strategy.
very
For
specific.
one of the fusion materials for Dark Flare Knight is a fusion monster itself, the Flame Swordsman. So you either had to find some way to also bring out a terrible vanilla fusion monster, or just play a fusion substitute monster, which was a lot more practical.
Or
As there
instant
wasn't really any
fusion.
other options on how to bring this card out back then. However, if you did manage to use the resources to bring this card out, then you'd have to find a way to destroy it by battle in order to get its good effect. So what you could do is just bank on the fact that it had 2200 attack and use it for poking for damage, and then just have Mirage Knight as a backup option in case it gets destroyed by battle. But the problem with that is that the floating effect only procs from being destroyed by battle, and there was a plethora of monster destruction early Yu-Gi-Oh!, as well as just mind control effects to take control of it. So they could just choose to never attack it and just remove it with one of the other plethora of removal spells instead, and completely bypass the floating effect, never having to deal with Mirage Knight.
Oof.
And then there was the fact that you had to play Mirage Knight in your main deck, which just added an unusable Garnet that could never be summoned if you drew it into your hand, as its condition made it so it could only be summoned by Dark Flare Knight's floating effect. And that's not even counting the fact that Dark Flare Knight is weaker than one of its fusion materials. And at number 3,
So again,
we have
no point.
Guardian Seal. This is a level 4 monster with 1700 attack, which cannot be summoned unless you control the equipped spell card Shooting Star Bolt Seal on your side of the field.
Oh, one
Shooting
of
Star Bolt
those.
Seal has the effect where the equipped monster loses 1000 attack, but it's able to attack your opponent directly. This card was actually used in some OTK strategies over the years, but it was only ever used in incredibly specific decks that did not care at all to use something like Guardian Seal, because they were trying to usually win on that turn by just attacking directly with a whole bunch of other equipped cards. And if you did manage to bring out Guardian Seal, it had the effect where you could send 1 equipped spell card you control that is equipped to this card to the graveyard in order to destroy 1 monster your opponent controls. Now, here's the problem
And
with
that's
this
about
card.
it.
You're not able to use the original equipped card that's equipped to it on the field for its summoning requirement in the first place as the material to be used for its effect to destroy monsters, because Guardian Seal only allows you to use equipped spells that are equipped to it currently, and not just equipped cards that you control on the field in general. So you would
again,
have to use
limitation.
Shooting Star Bolt Seal on one of your other monsters, normal summon Guardian Seal, then equip a different equipped spell card from your hand to it in order to destroy something. And for all the effort required to do that, it's really not worth only being able to destroy 1 monster, when you can instead just play something like Fissure. So it's basically a hard to bring out monster with an effect that wouldn't be very good even if it wasn't a hard to bring out monster, which definitely puts it into nearly garbage tier. And at number 2, we have Checkmate. This is a normal spell
Oh, it's
card which
another
has the effect
Archfiend
where you
card.
contribute one Archfiend monster you control in order to make it so a specifically named monster Terror King Archfiend on your side of the field can attack your opponent's life points directly this turn. Now, Terror King Archfiend is a level 4 monster that can only be normal summon if you already have an Archfiend monster on your side of the field. And as we discussed earlier, the other Archfiend monsters were terrible. One of the worst archetypes ever made before they released a whole bunch of retrain support that had nothing to do with the original monsters. So in order to even bring out Terror King, you had to use something like Archfiend's Roar in order to special summon one of your Archfiend monsters from your graveyard. Then you could normal summon this card. Then you can activate Checkmate so that Terror King can attack for 2,000 points of damage. However, what's funny
Just
about Terror King's
2,000,
effect
huh?
is that if it destroys the monster by battle, it's able to negate the effects of the monster it destroyed, which was actually a pretty decent effect in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, where there were tons of monsters that floated when they were destroyed by battle, or flip effects. So having a card like Checkmate, which allowed it to attack directly, seemed kind of counterintuitive to its actual effects. And also, it having a cost of having to tribute an Archfiend monster specifically to use for an effect that can only work on one specific monster, that's not even a very good effect for that monster, is kind of all kinds of convoluted and
Bad.
just not very good. If anything, this might be one of the most not very good spell cards in the game that wasn't specifically designed to be bad like Cold Feet. However, the only reason this card isn't number 1 on this list is because it was also released in the same set that released one of the worst boss monsters in the game's history that's even harder to use. And at number 1, we have Exodia Necros. This is a level 4
Ooh.
monster with 1800 attack that can only be special summoned with the effect of Contract with Exodia. And the card Contract with Exodia has the effect where you can only activate if you have all 5 pieces of Exodia in your graveyard, which allows you to special summon Exodia Necros.
So you need 6 cards in order to summon
this is an incredibly
Necros.
difficult monster to summon, because getting 5 named monsters in your graveyard at the same time is incredibly difficult. Something that would be hard to do even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! With modern support cards, let alone cards from the early days of the game. The intended way to bring this card out easier was with the card Painful Choice, which could easily get all 5 pieces in the graveyard with 1 card, which is probably why they thought Contract with Exodia would be so good that they had to restrict it so it could only special summon Exodia Necros from your hand, because if it could be special summoned from the deck, it would obviously be too overpowered. Now, let's take a look at what Exodia Necros actually does when it's on the field. While it's on the field, it cannot be destroyed by battle or the effects of spell and trap cards. Then, during each of your standby phases, it gains a permanent buff of 500 attack points. And also, if at any point all 5 pieces of Exodia are not in your graveyard, or if just one of them is moved, the card will immediately destroy itself. So, having protection from battle and destruction from spell and trap effects is actually pretty decent protection for early Yu-Gi-Oh!
It's good.
Monster destruction effects did exist and were played,
Ooh.
but they weren't as plentiful as spell or trap card removal.
128
so,
bucks.
If you got
Nice.
Exodia Necros on the field, there is a chance it would probably survive for a few turns. And with it surviving for a few turns, it would probably eventually get to a high enough attack point value where they would have to have no real option for dealing with it except to draw into one of their monster removal effects, and it just leads to a really early Yu-Gi-Oh! Version of having a Towers-like monster. Luckily, early Yu-Gi-Oh! Never had to worry about this card because it was so incredibly difficult to bring out. Painful Choice wasn't banned when Exodia Necros was introduced to the game, but it was limited to 1 copy, which meant the combo to bring this card out was incredibly flimsy and not very consistent. You'd have to draw into Painful Choice, Exodia Necros, and Contract with Exodia in order to actually bring the card out, while also playing 5 Garnets in your deck on top of that. And if you did manage to bring all this out, there was a chance it might be able to win you the game as long as your opponent didn't have Exiled Force, Man-Eater Bug, or Tribe Infecting Virus.
Yeah.
The set Invasion of Chaos is probably the set which power crept Yu-Gi-Oh! The hardest, where it released cards that are so broken that even today they would be considered good cards if they were released into the modern era. But there was also a lot of really bad cards in this monumental set, which we'll be going over in this video. And at number 10, we have Witch Doctor of Chaos. This is a flip monster with 500 attack and defense, which has
I
the
remember
effect
this
where
one.
you can play 1 monster in your opponent's graveyard when it's flip face up. Now, in early Yu-Gi-Oh!, flip monsters were actually pretty heavily played, but only if they had good effects. The Invasion of Chaos set had a whole bunch of cards that interacted with the Banishing of Cards, as it was the set that introduced the Chaos Monsters, which were a series of monsters that summoned themselves by bringing from play a light and dark monster from your graveyard. And there were a ton of other cards in the set that just banished cards in the graveyard in order to bring themselves out too, including a whole host of cards with the 4 main attributes as well. So, Witch Doctor of Chaos was obviously meant as a way to try to counter a lot of these brand new cards that required all of these monsters in the graveyard. So, obviously, being able to banish one of your opponent's monsters from the graveyard was a premium. Except
Beneficial.
it wasn't that much of a premium, especially since it only targeted 1 monster and required your normal summon as well as being flip face up. It was just too slow to actually accomplish what it was trying to do, which is why it never saw any competitive play. Even if a lot of other cards which do banish monsters from the graveyard to bring themselves out did. Technically, it is a useful effect, and if you do get the effect off, it can put you ahead, which makes it better than every other card on this list. And at number 9, we have Griffin's Feather Duster. This is a spell card which has the ability to destroy all of your other spell and trap cards. Then you gain life points equal to 500 times the number of
it's the
cards
opposite
destroyed.
of Harpy's
So
Feather
Griffin's Feather
Duster.
Duster is basically just a slower version of Emergency Provisions, which does a similar thing, except it allows you to choose which of your cards get sent to the graveyard instead of destroying all of them, and also gives you 1,000 life points per card. And Emergency Provisions actually saw a lot of competitive play and even received a restriction on the ban list. So I have to assume Griffin's Feather Duster was released as a lower powered version of this obviously really ridiculously powerful card. But there was a little bit of a catch, and the fact that Emergency Provisions wasn't actually very good, and it was mainly Mirage of Nightmare that gave it any relevancy. And specifically because Emergency Provisions was a quick play card that could be used during your opponent's turn, or before your standby phase. Because if you could combo them together, then you'd end up at least +2 in card advantage. Griffin's Feather Duster cannot be comboed with Mirage of Nightmare, so it didn't really have any niches. So Griffin's Feather Duster was never actually super useful. But the ability to destroy all of your own spells and traps is situationally useful in some decks, which is why it's only at number 9. Because technically, the ability to destroy your own spells and traps can give you advantage in certain decks. And at number 8, we have Anti-Aircraft Flower. This is a level 3 plant monster which has the ability to tribute an insect monster to inflict 800 points of damage to your opponent's life points. So basically, it's like a
you need an
soldier,
insect
only
as well.
insect monsters.
Yeah, you just need
While
an
it
insect
itself
and it
is
only
not
deals
an insect,
800.
so it can't even tribute itself for a final 800 points of damage. At the very least, the effect is not once per turn. So if you have a way to get a whole bunch of insects on the field, this card can be a way to FTK your opponent in the same way you might use Cannon Soldier. So the effect does have potential to be pretty strong.
But again,
the only problem is that
insects.
there was never a deck that it could be used in this way. And that's pretty much it. The card was used in one of the NPC decks in Duel Links, so I'm sure a lot of people who farmed a lot of open world duels have probably seen this card more often than not, and might have even lost to it a few times just randomly burning you for game, because it was added to Duel Links before they cut all the life point effect damage in half. And at number 7, we have Coach Goblin. This is a level 4 monster with 1200 attack, which has the effect that during the end phase, in which it's face up on the field, you can return a normal monster from your hand to the bottom of your deck in order to draw 1 card. Now, technically,
I don't
the
remember
ability to
that.
mulligan one of your normal monsters in your hand is a good effect, because one of the problems with decks that have a whole bunch of normal monsters in them is that most of them treat those normal monsters as garnets that want to stay in your deck, including the infamous Gemini Garnet. So if you have a way to easily return those back to your deck in order to get draws, that would be an excellent card for a lot of different decks. The problem with cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That allow mulligans is most of them are really bad, or require you to go minus in card advantage in order to use them. And Coach Goblin
So there's almost
definitely
no
falls
point in
into the
using
very
them.
bad category. If the effect allowed you to use it during your main phase, it would still be a bad card, but it would at least be a lot more useful. If the card was not once per turn, it might actually be decent without any other changes. Even without technically gaining any advantage, being able to send all of your monsters back into your deck to draw hand traps would be pretty good. Or to just draw cards for other kinds of combos in the same way normal monsters are used with the Heart of the Underdog FTK decks. But only during the end phase and only once per turn kinda make the card just really incredibly slow and bad. That I'm sure most people don't even know this card exists because it sure has never seen any kind of competitive play. It's just another one of the bad mulligan cards that exists in the game. And at number 6, we have Dimension Distortion. This is a spell card which has the effect where if you have no cards in your graveyard, you can special summon one of your banished monsters. Now, seeing as this was
But you would
released in
have
the same set
to
with a whole bunch
banish
of monsters that banish
before you
monsters from
even
the
put
graveyard
something in
to
the
summon
grave.
themselves, as well as a whole bunch of other cards interact with banishing cards, it seems as if Dimension Distortion would actually be pretty good. With all the banishing that's happening in the graveyard, it seems like it would be really easy to have no cards in the graveyard, and at least one monster banished in order to use this effect. However, that situation rarely ever shows up. And the reason for that is because this card requires you to have no cards in your graveyard at all. If it only had the condition to have no monsters in your graveyard, then the card would actually be pretty decent.
But it also
almost
counts
every
spells
Yu-Gi-Oh
and
deck uses
traps.
some form of spells. Especially early Yu-Gi-Oh! When this card was released, where a whole bunch of cards like Graceful Charity and Pot of Greed were still legal. So a situation in which you had a monster banished was not a situation in which you had no spell cards in your graveyard as well, because a monster getting banished is a game state in which you have to kind of combo a little bit in order to get there, because despite how simple it might sound, getting a single monster banished is kind of difficult without also having a graveyard, especially in early Yu-Gi-Oh! That actually requires more setup. And because it requires setup, chances are you're just going to have other spells and traps in the graveyard already, which makes a card that seems like it might be useful actually
It just makes
quite
it
useless.
difficult to use.
And at number 5, we have Fiend's Hand Mirror. This is a trap card which has the effect that if your opponent activates a spell card which specifically targets a spell or trap card, you can change that target to another correct target. So basically, if your opponent uses Mystical Space Typhoon, you can use it to destroy one of your opponent's spells and traps instead of one of your own, because there were not.
But you'd
a lot
have to
of
make
spell
sure your
cards that
opponent has a
specifically
spell or
targeted
trap on the
spell
field
trap
as
cards in
well.
the early days of the game. And even then, if your opponent didn't have any other spell cards to actually redirect Mystical Space Typhoon to, then this card was kind of useless.
Yeah.
So Fiend's Hand Mirror kind of falls into the category of an incredibly specific counter card, which generally don't see much play unless they have really huge upsides to those incredibly specific counters. And Fiend's Hand Mirror also has another sin of having one of the worst kinds of effects in the game, that being a redirect effect. On surface level, redirect effects seem like they're pretty good, because you're basically turning your opponent's cards against them. But they're largely not as good as just having a straight up negate, because it requires your opponent to do a very specific action while having a very specific game state as well, in order to gain any kind of advantage from it. So if they don't have anything for you to redirect that card to, then the card actually just can't be used in a lot of cases.
And it doesn't work.
Whereas if at least it was a negate, you'd still be able to stop it. And at number 4, we have Chaos Greed. This spell card has the effect where if you have 4 or more cards currently banished and have no cards in your graveyard, you get to draw 2 cards. So just like with Dimension Distortion, this card requires you to have nothing in your graveyard in order to activate it.
Again.
However, it has an even stricter cost of having at least 4 cards banished. And like I said before, banishing 1 card is kind of difficult already, and keeping a clear graveyard in the process of doing that is even harder. So getting 4 cards banished without a graveyard is an astronomical task. It's so hard, you would literally have to build your deck around trying to resolve this card. This is how badly designed these no graveyard
Just
cards
making
are,
an all
where
banishment
the only one
deck.
that's worth its effect in the set would probably be DD Borderline, and even that card only requires no spell cards in your graveyard instead of nothing in your grave. Even if technically drawing 2 cards is an incredibly good effect, the condition for this is just too tough, that it definitely never saw any competitive play, which is really funny because the conditions don't seem like it should be that hard. It doesn't require any specific cards for the condition, just any 4 banished cards of any type, and just no graveyard. But there's a reason they stopped printing cards that don't require a graveyard after this set, because the few cards they did print that required no graveyard to be used in this way just never saw any play, because the requirement alone was already too difficult to accomplish. And it just didn't seem like it would be a big deal in the first place when they printed these cards, especially in a set all about banishing cards from the graveyard.
Yeah, that's what they thought.
And at number 3, we have Insect Princess. This is a level 6 monster with 1900 attack.
Oh wait, I
which
think
has
I
the
actually
effect
have this
where
card.
all of your opponent's insect monsters are changed to attack position, and if this card destroys an insect by battle, it gains 500 attack permanently. So basically, it's an anti-insect card, while also being an insect monster. Now, insect decks were not super prevalent back in the day, so the way they intended you to use this card was as a combo piece with Parasite, a card so infamously bad that the only way to make it playable was to have a skill in Duel Links that literally just cheated it into your opponent's deck before the duel started. And the thing is, Insect Princess did exist in the game with that skill, and was not used in Parasite decks and Duel Links.
Seems like a lot of these
in
cards are
decks
better
it was
in Duel Links
specifically
than they are in
designed
the
for,
actual
the effect was
TCG.
just not good enough. It only has 1900 attack for 1 tribute, which is pretty low. The only reason Air Knight Parshath saw competitive play back in the day, despite having the same stats for 1 tribute, is because it drew a card if it successfully dealt battle damage, so you can go +1 in card advantage. And with its ability to deal piercing damage, you very often got to draw 1 card because of all the flip monsters being played. Whereas Insect Princess will not give you any kind of card advantage, but most likely lose you advantage trying to
So
break
the
it
lack
out,
of
and then
benefits.
have an incredibly mediocre floodgate that might not even hamper your opponent at all. And its effect is not even that good, despite requiring specific monsters to be destroyed by battle. If instead you got to draw a card just like Air Knight Parshath, it would still be bad because it only works on insects. And at number 2, we have Destruction Ring. This is a normal trap card which has the effect to destroy 1 face-up monster you control to inflict 1000 damage to both players' life points. Now, this card is obviously a weaker version of Ring of Destruction.
Yep,
which in
I
the
was just about to
original
say.
version allowed you to destroy any monster on the field for no cost, and then inflict damage to both players equal to the attack of that monster. And very often, Ring of Destruction would be used to destroy your own monster in order to just burn your opponent for game. So
Which is
that
good.
was the idea behind Destruction Ring. Since people were using Ring of Destruction to destroy their own monsters so often anyway, and to just burn for game, Destruction Ring seems like it's just a slightly weaker version of that. The
But
only problem
worse.
is that the reason Ring of Destruction was so good was specifically because it had that as an option, and not that being the whole point of the card. The versatility of being able to burn your opponent by destroying your own cards was just an added bonus, on top of the main reason of using the card to destroy your opponent's cards. And the burn was significant enough that it could also be used to cause tie games or even just kill your opponent. Something Destruction Ring can't really do with only a measly 1000 life point burn. If Destruction Ring burned for at
that
least
would definitely be
2000
an
points of
end game
damage,
trap.
then we might be talking. But at only 1000, this card is just kind of useless, because you essentially go -2 in card advantage to do 1000 damage to yourself and your opponent. And at number 1, we have Thunder Crash. If you thought destroying one of your cards to deal 1000 damage to your opponent was bad, how about destroying 3 of your cards for only 900 points of damage to your opponent? As what Thunder Crash does is it destroys all of your monsters, then deals 300 damage to your opponent for each of your monsters destroyed.
Oh, that's
so it's
bad.
basically a fully negative card. All it does is get rid of your own cards for a measly amount of life point damage, making it actually a runner for one of the worst cards in the game. Now, I wouldn't say it is the worst card in the game because there are a lot of monsters with floating effects that you could actually plus off of if you destroyed one of them with Thunder Crash, but even in those kinds of decks, they wouldn't use it because the card just doesn't really do anything, as there are a lot of other cards that you can use to destroy your own cards and gain some better advantages than just doing some light life point damage, like using a Dark Hole to destroy all of your opponent's cards as well. I have to assume this card was created as a counterpart to Griffin's Feather Duster, which was also released in the same set, where they thought, hey, if we have a card whose whole purpose is to destroy your own cards for a little bit of a benefit, might as well make one for your monsters as well. It's just monsters
and it was still bad.
Resources to get on the field, be it your 1 normal summon per turn or other cards to special summon them, whereas you can set as many spell traps as you want from your hand. So, if you were to destroy a whole bunch of your own monsters, you're generally just losing more resources than if you pop all your own spell traps, even if monsters can float more regularly than spells and traps do. Which is why Thunder Crash is at number 1, because it's a self-board wipe for cards that require resources to get on the field. Be them cards that get you advantage every turn, or powerful floodgates.
Ooh, continuous spells. This'll be fun.
Game if they stick around. However, that is not the case for all of them, of course. And in this video, we're going to be going over the worst of their kind to ever be printed.
I can think of a couple.
At number 10, we have the Jam Breeding Machine. This continuous spell activates during each of your standby phases and special summons a level 1 Aqua Slime token with 500 attack and defense and attack position to your side of the field. And while this card is face up on the field, you cannot summon monsters except slime tokens. Like with most cards referencing something that happened in the anime, this is a total disappointment. You can't even use it for its intended purpose in the show, getting tributes for the Egyptian gods, because it locks you out of summoning while it sticks around, and none of the gods can
Yeah, the
contribute.
anime made that
Granted,
card
a
so much
that
better.
Just gives you advantage for free every standby phase would be pretty broken at the time. Sinister Serpent even got banned for just returning to your hand every turn. Treeborn Frog is essentially a good version of Jam Breeding Machine, being a free body every standby phase, and it doesn't stop you from tributing it away. Treeborn ended up seeing a lot of play, and even ended up on the Forbidden Limited list for a while. However,
I still want to get a copy of Treeborn Frog.
Did not have that much luck, as there aren't that many good uses for it. It's not useful for protecting your life points, since the tokens must be special summoned in attack position with their paltry 500 stats. Now, the card doesn't stop you from playing entirely, since you can still set monsters, so you could play it with flip monsters. Still, since you can't flip them yourself, you're going to be relying on your opponent to attack into them and do that for you.
But the slimes are going to be intact, so they got a better choice of
like Spiritual Watermark
target.
Aoi or Enemy Controller. It's going to be very hard to capitalize off of any advantage when you can't bring actual good monsters out. This might be a terrible card, but it at least does something, and that alone makes it one of the least worst on this list. And at number 9, we have the Spirit Messages. These are continuous spells portraying the letters I, N, A, L, and their sole effect is that they must be placed on the field by the effective Destiny board. This being a continuous trap that sticks around on the field and places a spirit message from your hand or deck into the board.
So they can only be played because of Destiny board.
All 5, you win the duel. Carried on with the anime that translated badly, where you got these 4 terrible bricks. The biggest issue with the Destiny board win con is that it takes a lot of turns for it to fully resolve, and your opponent has to not interact with you in any way. At which point, you probably could have just beaten them to death in less time. The worst part is that since Destiny board blows away all the other pieces of the puzzle if any of them leave the field by any means, you're always 1 MST away from being sent back to square one. On top of that, since Destiny board
you really need to have some sort of spell and trap protection.
You're not going to be able to go for it again in the same duel. There's also the issue that you would need to stop your opponent from killing you on these turns, and the easiest way of doing that would be with floodgates, most of which are continuous spells and traps. You need to have your 5 spell and trap card zones filled in with final for Destiny board to win you the game, meaning that these same floodgates that would keep you alive also prevent you from winning entirely. as the card won't be able to activate and place the last piece. There's a
Ooh,
reason why Exodia has
got a
always
good
been
pull.
the best you win the duel card. Interacting with the hand is much harder than with the field, and being able to play heavy search and draw power to speed up your win sure beats having to wait around for it instead. But hey, even if winning with Destiny Board might be the one thing harder than winning with Jam Breeding Machine Slime tokens, being able to win with it at all already helps it a step above most other cards on this list. And
Yeah.
at number 8, we have Card Shuffle. As you can
Oh,
probably
there's
tell,
Card
this card
Shuffle
lets you
again.
shuffle either player's deck once per turn by paying 300 life points. Well, this is the closest you can get to a card doing literally nothing before you get into Toon World territory. However, even that card managed to at least see some play since it was searchable to Table of Contents and got your life points down for Reversal Quiz OTK. On the other hand, you need to look pretty hard to find good applications for Card Shuffle, with most of them being slightly beneficial at best. Getting fate sealed by cards that mess with your top deck like Ryza and Phoenix Wing Wind Blast has got to be one of the most devastating things that can happen to you in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you look at it, no matter how bad Card Shuffle might seem, it is a way to get rid of that sort of luck. However, needless to say, that's never going
It's
to
not
be
worth
the
the
best way to
300
go
life
about
points.
it. In fact, playing this card will probably make your matchup with these kinds of cards even worse, since it's a perfect target for them to stack on top of your deck. Either way, you're much rather to get out of the situation by playing cards that modify your deck instead, like
Ooh,
a Sandgan
that's a good
Surfing or
pull.
a Card Trooper Melee. When looking at a way to use this card against your opponent, well, you're going to need to look at their top deck at any time for this to be of any use. Convulsion of Nature instantly comes to mind, but at that point you're looking at a 2-card combo to maybe make your opponent draw a blank. You wouldn't have to worry so much about your opponent's top deck if
So at
you
that
had
point,
access to
there's
useful cards
no
instead of
reason.
this awful combo. Not to mention that if you want to pair Convulsion with another continuous spell, you might as well go with Archfiend's Oath, which will give you an extra draw every turn per copy instead. To this day, Card Shuffle and Tainted Wisdom are the only cards whose only effect is to shuffle a deck, and hopefully it stays that way for well in the foreseeable future. And at
Yeah.
number 7, we have Spiritual Energy Settle Machine. As long as this card is face up on the field, all spirit monsters don't have to return themselves to the hand with their effects during the end phase. However, you must discard one card during each of your end phases or the card destroys itself. And last, if this card is removed from the field, all spirit monsters return to their owner's hand. So, just for a little bit of context, spirits are a type of monster that usually can't be special summoned and return to the hand during the end phase of a turn in which they're normal summoned or flip face up. This card
that was
lets
their
you
whole
get around
gimmick.
that last caveat of them. So, sounds pretty good for a spirit deck, right? Well,
No.
not really. Most of the playable spirit monsters are already made with that design in mind. Tsukiyomi flips a monster face down, and Dark Dust Spirit destroys all other face-up monsters when normal summoned, and so were played as a reusable utility that would all dodge spell speed 1 removal. Even the then feared Yatagarasu benefited more from coming back to the hand at the end of the turn, so your opponent wouldn't be able to beat over it with its tiny body. All the spirits you'd want to keep around the field were either incredibly unreasonable to bring out, like the 2 tributes, or came out so much later on in the game's history that by then there were better ways to make them stick around. On the other hand, since this card does affect both players, you could get the idea of playing as a counter for that instead, except that spirit decks were never really a thing. Most of them were only splashed into regular decks as text, because their effects were never that cohesive. The one deck that called itself Spirits came out much later on, and only used them as a rank 4 engine with Sakitama and Aratama. Yosenju was a whole archetype that was meant to be a modern take on Spirits, but since they lacked the actual subtype, they were completely unaffected by this card. The cherry on top of all this is that they thought this card was strong enough to require a maintenance cost of a discard per turn.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Turn to maybe slightly inconvenience your opponent in the best of cases. And at number 6, we have Samsara. This spell makes it so the monsters tributed for ritual summon are returned to their owner's deck instead of being sent to the graveyard. Continue on with the trend with cards that are so bad you can't even tell whether they're support or anti-support. We've got this. So on one hand, you could be teching Samsara to reuse monsters you tributed for a ritual summon by shuffling them back. However, a card that provides no value up front and only helps you when you're already doing what you're supposed to be doing makes no sense to run. Not to mention that if putting monsters back in your deck was any important to your strategy, you could be doing so while also going plus by just playing Pot of Avarice. When you're looking at this card from the other angle, as an anti-ritual floodgate, it still makes no sense to play. Even the first real ritual deck, Demise OTK, did not care much about the tributes actually hitting the graveyard anyways. More importantly, the main ritual spell they used, Advanced Ritual Art, did not even tribute monsters, but rather just sent vanillas from the deck to the graveyard instead, which bypasses Samsara entirely. That's sort of the theme with most ritual decks that have been relevant actually. The mechanic is so inherently bad that most decks cheat it to some degree, and so just ignore this card entirely. You had the Necrons, which could ritual summon by banishing from the graveyard or dumping cards from the extra deck to the graveyard. And Drytrons, which could ritual summon by detaching materials from an Xyz monster. Sure, Samsara could
So at this
potentially be
point, the
annoying,
card
but
just
modern deck is
loses all
voiceless
point,
because they actually
lose all
tribute
reason
from the
to
summons, and like
be on the
having
field.
cards like Low hitting the graveyard. But if you're looking at it this way, there's several other cards that demolish ritual strategies rather than slightly hindering them. Dimensional Barrier straight up stops ritual summoning for a whole turn, which is all you really need to win nowadays. Even if you want something that lasts forever, Mask of Restricts predates Samsara by years and stops your opponent from tributing anything in any situation. So whether you play rituals or go up against them, there's no reason to have Samsara in your deck. And at number 5, we have Impenetrable Formation. This continuous spell requires you to choose a monster on your side of the field when activated. And then, while you control 2 or more monsters, and they're all in defense position, the chosen monster gains 700 defense. Also, if that monster leaves the field, destroy this card. It just makes no sense why
There we go.
Konami would
Now
make a
everyone can
card
walk
that's
in
just
fresh.
an equip spell with extra steps, and yet here we are. This card's mechanics are almost exactly the same as one, except you need extra monsters on the field, have everything in certain battle positions, and to keep them like that to get this card's boost off. Without even getting to the fact that equip spells are just naturally easier to search, they also often give you better effects for less of a hassle.
So a lot of
Or
requirements
Unicorn
needed for
came out
that spell to
several years
even
before this
matter.
card, and it just gives the monster a 700 boost to both attack and defense. And even that got power crept rather quickly by United We Stand, which gives the monster 800 in both stats for each face-up monster you control, meaning that in the same conditions as Impenetrable Formation, you're getting an extra 900 defense. This card is heavily outclassed, even just ignoring these 2 couple of cards that also give you an attack boost that lets you beat over stuff. The only thing that Impenetrable Formation might have going for it is that it won't destroy itself by game mechanics if the monster is flipped face down, which is actually a pretty big downside that equips have. With that said, if you have a monster that's gaining defense out of the field, odds are your opponent is not going to be spending their Book of Moon to flip it face down, making it almost meaningless. Even if this card gave you a flat 700 defense boost to every one of your monsters, it would still see no play, as there's always more value in being proactive than anything else. Slamming down monsters with
Big
Solidarity
spender.
was once a viable win con, but Turnerlet with this fantasy version of Impenetrable Formation never would. Of course, if Sanctuary begins looking more like a real card when it's next to you, you know things couldn't be any worse. And at number 4, we have the 2nd and 3rd Sarcophagi. These are 2 continuous spells whose only text restricts them to only being able to place on the field by the effect of the first Sarcophagus.
Which is,
a continuous trap that puts them from your hand or deck on the field during your opponent's end phase. When you assemble all 3 of them, you send them all to the graveyard and then special summon a Spirit of the Pharaoh from your hand or deck. Your big payoff for all of this is a level 6 light zombie with 2500 attack that can reborn up to 4 level 2 or lower normal zombie monsters from your graveyard. As you can probably tell, these cards share a lot with the Spirit Message cards from earlier. You get a clock that's 2 turns shorter.
2 spell cards that are useless without a trap, and at the end they summon a monster that really isn't worth it.
Beater. The Pharaoh's effect is almost completely irrelevant. The best low-level normal monster you can get off of this is Clown Zombie, a 1350 beater, meaning that even if you could somehow have 4 copies of it in your deck and revive all of them with the Spirit of the Pharaoh
somehow,
to on an empty board, it still would not be enough damage for an OTK. Besides, putting 3 vanillas into the graveyard is actually pretty hard, even more so back in the day. You'd probably have to be running a heavy mill package with Raikos and Lilas and the like. Except that you can't because, just like with Destiny board, if any of the Sarcophagi or the Spirit hit the graveyard at any time, the rest of the cards all become useless. At least the Destiny board eventually makes your opponent interact with it because it does win you the game. But you can just let the first Sarcophagus fully resolve with little to no consequences. Odds are they haven't got the setup needed for Pharaoh to be any good. And even if they do, it's just a bunch of beaters. A single Mirror Force and it's all gone. It's fitting that the meta with these cards is to bring out the clowns, because you'd have to be one in order to be ready this nonsense. And at number 3, we have Senrai. This spell allows you to, once during
this card again.
phases, pay 100 life points to look at the top card of your opponent's deck, and then put it back. There's definitely some
Y'all gotta
value in
slow down,
your
I'm starting to run
opponent's
low on
top. One of
inventory.
the most infuriating things about playing against Spiral was that they'd always make you draw the worst out of your top 3 cards. And the same was true when going up against stun decks using Goddess Skull's Oracle to hide your spell and trap removal every turn. Of course, there's a pretty big rift between Senrai and these 2 techs that have actually seen meta play. The first being that you don't get to do anything about your opponent's top deck. Senrai also does nothing the turn you put it down on the field. It needs to stick through a whole opponent's turn and still be on your side of the field in the standby phase for it to get its effect off. Then you can see if your opponent is going to top deck the perfect answer to your board, but there's still nothing that you can do about it. Well, unless you want to combo this card with
It
another
basically
all-star
does
from our list
nothing.
earlier, Card Shuffle. The point is that just knowing what your opponent will draw is almost completely useless if you can't interact with it. Instead of this, you could have had an actual answer to whatever will make you lose the game at the time. It's not even 100% sure to give you the proper info, since it only looks during the standby phase, meaning that if you hit into a recruiter in the battle phase, for example, your opponent's deck will get shuffled, and you'll be in the dark again. Imagine going through all the trouble to unlock the third eye, only for it to be as useless as this card. And at number 2, we have Shifting Shadows. This continuous spell lets you, once per turn, pay 300 life points to rearrange your face-down monsters on the field. So the idea with this card is that even if your monsters are set, your opponent can still know some information about them. Like, what if they were brought out by a card that specials a monster face down, or they got the monster flipped at some point, or maybe the monster has been set on the field for a couple of turns now.
So there's very limited uses for that.
If any of these apply, and you've got multiple monsters set out, you can use Shifting Shadows to hide them again. The issue is that this is extremely convoluted. Requires you to multiple monsters out in this card, all for a very marginal information advantage that may not even work. Even if you rearrange your sets when there's a monster you want your opponent hit into, and when you don't, there's a 50% chance your opponent will guess right anyways. And yeah, you can increase your odds if you have many more monsters than your opponent does, but odds are you aren't winning on board if one of your cards was Shifting Shadows instead of a more useful one. Even the monster version of this card, Wandering Mummy, puts it to shame because it at least can be used as a 1500 beater. If you really want to protect your set monsters, there are many other cards to prevent them from being dealt with in battle or outside of it, with no guesswork involved. Even a pure flip deck would have trouble justifying a slot for this anywhere on their list. And finally, at number 1, we've got Blessings of the Nile. While this card is face up on the field, each time a card is discarded from your hand to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, you gain 1000 life points. There's nothing worse than getting your hand ripped in Yu-Gi-Oh! So a card that helps you make up for it sounds like a good idea, right? Well,
but
you're
how
not
often?
going to be doing so by just gaining 1000 life points. Even if you have a handful of bricks, a card in your hand is worth much, much more than that. The thousands of life points you'd get by getting your hand ripped apart by Delinquent Duo or repeated Gothams activations are not going to do anything to win you the duel. They might just delay the inevitable at best. Having this face up is not going to deter anyone from doing that. And even if you are playing some sort of life point gain stall strategy, there are better cards for that. Solemn Wishes is another awful card, but it just gains you 500 life points each turn whenever you draw a card, which is something that's going to happen way more often during a duel than getting cards discarded from your hand by your opponent. If you really wanted to counter an opponent trying to win with hand destruction, you have Gemini Imps, a hand trap made specifically for that, and Dark Worlds, an entire archetype built to plus off that. The latter of which actually saw quite a bit of play for that reason in formats where people were just spamming Spirit Reapers or Airbellums. Blessing of the Nile is also extremely narrow in which kind of hand disruptions it triggers, even with its minuscule payoff. Take something like Forceful Sentry. It'll get rid of a card in your hand without giving you anything in return, since it gets shuffled back. Spiritual Water Aoi's wording sends the card to the graveyard instead of discarding it, meaning no 1000 life points for you as well. The same applies to Trishula and Omega, since they're banishing it. So we're looking at a card that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, and doesn't even work when it's supposed to. As bad as they were, some of the other stinkers on this list were at least semi-useful during very specific niche situations. But when it comes to this one, well, the only blessing is the one your opponent is getting from you having this in your deck. In this video, we're calling the classic era just any cards released before Synchros. And in this, we're going to look at some of the worst equip spells of these older cards. Starting us off at number 10, we have Scroll of Bewitchment. This is an equip spell that asks you to declare an attribute upon activation, and then equip monster becomes that attribute. This card just does too little on its own to ever be worth running. There are no innate
changes attributes,
to specific attribute in Yu-Gi-Oh! So what this card does is be entirely reliant on other cards on the field. For example, if you've got your opponent floodgated under Shadow Imprisoning Mirror, you can use the scroll as a way to negate monster effects. The thing is that most of these interactions are just not worthwhile if you need to also have a generally useless card like the scroll for them to work. Let's say your opponent is locked under Gozen Match, which restricts players to having a single attribute on the field. You can equip the scroll to one of their guys and declare another one to use it as a removal spell, since it'll force them to send it to the graveyard. While that's a non-destruction removal, it's still way clunkier than just using some targeted removal like Soul Taker. If you're looking at
Yeah,
more
so what's
modern
the
options,
point?
there are cards like Layer of Darkness and Stealth Kraken that change all the monsters of the field to an attribute instead, making their synergy with Goes and Badge way better than this card's. The other use for Scroll is enabling you to use attribute support on your cards you usually would not be able to, like Calling Light and suddenly being able to use Honest on anything, or Earth and then having an easier time making an Echeria Beast. Neither of these are bad cards per se, but if they require to have a specific equip to make use of them, they would be, making Scroll Bewitchment not worth considering ever. And at number 9, we've got Armed Changer. This card must be activated by sending another equip spell from your hand to the graveyard. While it's equipped to a monster, if it destroys something by battle, that monster's controller can add a monster with an attack equal to or less than the equipped ones from the graveyard back to hand. The inherent problem with equips, and the reason why they're the weakest kind of spells overall, is the potential to get 2 for 1 if your opponent removes the monster it was equipped to. It doesn't matter
Right.
how many equips your monster has, if the monster gets outed, the equips all go with him. Arm Changer makes that even worse with its heavy cost of pitching another equip spell from your hand, handing a 3 for 1 straight on the platter for your opponent. As if that wasn't bad enough, the payoff is just no good. It doesn't boost the monster's stats or give it any sort of protection, so you'll need a decently statted guy out to make use of it in the first place. And even if you do assemble all of that and manage to beat over something by battle, what you get isn't worth the effort. Recycling monsters from the graveyard is pretty strong, especially back then when your options were pretty limited, but this card just doesn't do its job well. Most monsters could be recycled more easily via revival spells like Call of the Haunted or Premature Burial. The ones that couldn't usually had such high stats you'd have a hard time ever getting them back with Arm Changer anyway. Then if you advance just a little bit further in time, there's no reason why you'd ever want to run it over Monster Reincarnation, which is only usable once, yeah, but it's guaranteed to get whatever monster you want back, unlike this terrible card. And at number 8, there's Vicious Claw. This spell gives the equipped monster 300 attack, and if it would be destroyed by battle, you return Vicious Claw to your hand instead, and then destroy a monster in the field except the one that battled the equipped monster, and your opponent takes 600 damage. After that resolves, you special summon a 2500 attack and defense evil token to your opponent's side of the field. During the turn this card is returned to your hand, you can't use it again for the turn. This card has a string of effects so confusing and seemingly disconnected, you'd think it was AI generated, if not for being printed all the way back in 2008. If you wanted either an attack boost or battle protection, there are many other equips which could give you so without having to jump through so many hoops. So you equip this
Yeah,
to a
it seems like a
monster,
bit
and
much.
then can sit on it without worrying about it being beaten over, right? Well, not really. Imagine you have a monster equipped with this and then your opponent goes and tries to destroy it by battle. Even if Vicious Claw prevents that battle destruction, this second part of its effect will trigger and force you to destroy a monster in the field except the attacking one. So if your opponent only has a single monster, you'll be forced to pop one of yours. If both of you only have a single monster on the field, that could very well mean you protected yours from being destroyed by battle, only to be forced to destroy it with Vicious Claw's effect. Then, if all that wasn't enough, it still will give your opponent a huge token for their trouble. In the end, this card's random tacked on 600 burn might be its most beneficial effect overall. The only good thing we can say about Vicious
600.
Claw is that it's one of the few anime cards whose effect was kept intact when being brought over to the TCG, for better or for worse. And at number 7, we've got Amplifier. This card can only be equipped to Jinzo and changes its effect to only negate the trap cards of your opponent, and also has some old school spell speed for protection, where its activation and effect cannot be negated. Now, while Jinzo did see a ton of competitive play back in the day, and even occasionally sees play today, as its stats are premium for its 1 tribute cost and total negation of a third of the cards in the game, its specific equip card was usually not played alongside it. And that's because, while being able to use your traps while Jinzo was out was good, it wasn't enough. Because Jinzo being out and negating your opponent's traps back in the day was usually a death sentence already, so you didn't even need to use your traps to close out a win. The most common types of traps were monster removal, so Jinzo was perfectly safe as is, and could easily swing over most non-tribute summoned monsters. Plus, even if you were playing a ton of traps, you probably wouldn't be playing Jinzo in your deck, because you couldn't rely on drawing into Amplifier to be able to use your traps. In Duel Links, they had a skill which increased the attack of Jinzo by 500 points when it was equipped with Amplifier, and it still wasn't used. And in Duel Links, the deck size limit is 20, so it's much easier to dig for the card you want. But simply being able to also use your traps and having a 500 attack boost was just not enough, even in the slow format of Duel Links when skill and Jinzo were added.
Yeah, so
The only
overall
use
it
for
just needed a
Amplifier
bit
is in
more.
funny infinite combo decks, like if there was a skill drain in Royal Decree out and Jinzo kept turning them on and off. And at number 6, we have Demotion, an equip that lowers the equipped monster's level by 2. This card's effect is just too minor to do anything, and the situation it's useful in are so specific it might as well make Scroll Bewitchment look like a staple. The funniest thing about Demotion is that it came out way back in 2003 when there was pretty much no cards that cared about a monster's level on the field. With
Yeah,
its
there was
latest
almost
card
no
being in
reason back then
2005,
because there
it
were
still
no,
kept its pre-problem
like,
solving card
say,
text effect, which says
synchros,
it downgrades the
XCs, or anything
monster.
like that.
So the first uses that come to mind for this card would be using it to set up your own synchro plays with it, except that would never be worth it. Level modulation is an effect that's never worth an entire card for. In most instances, it would just be added as a benefit to an already good effect. Even so, back then, most of the commonly used tuners were levels 2 or 3, and there was just less value in the level 1s. With the most common level being 4, a level 1 tuner would enable you to go into Cataster, a magical android, who are by no means bad, but the 6s and 7s were more powerful monsters most of the time. And if you look at this card in the opposite direction, as a way to disrupt your opponent's plays, it's more akin to a very minor speed bump. If they're on a single strategy, odds are their tuners aren't going to be sticking on the field. And if they are, it's because they've got some other effect that makes them good. The first archetype to really care about its own levels, Fortune Ladies, was never really such a threat to need specific hate like this. Even in Duel Links, where they were actually meta, you'd be better off just playing anything else too. While later on, we'd get more archetypes that care about their levels like FAs or Cleaforts, there was still no reason to have downgrade over actual removal. And even if you really wanted to go after your opponent's levels just for the sake of it, you'd be better off with Stygian Dirge and Mischief of the Good Gnomes, messing with them permanently instead. By slotting this card in, the only thing getting downgraded is your own deck. And at number 5, we have a Laser Cannon Armor. This card increases the attack and defense of an insect monster equipped with it by 300 points. By all metrics, this is the worst stat boost equip in the whole game.
Oh, that's one of the basic equip spells from the very beginning.
Main set to be released, Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon in 2002.
Yep.
Even then, it'd go on to get power crept only a few months later in Metal Raiders, the very next set, as we got Sword of Deep-Seated, a 500 boost, and for any type of monster too. But even before that came out, this card already floundered compared to its competition. LOB actually had a full series of typal equip spells.
Yeah,
and
there they are.
Even if none of them were ever more than playground playable, the insect one is especially bad. If you look at the card pool of the oldest Yu-Gi-Oh format people play, Yugi Kaiba format, which includes the aforementioned Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon and starter decks for Kaiba and Yugi, there's just nothing you'd ever want to equip a Laser Cannon Armor on. Even though Maneater Bug is a playable card in there, it's not a monster you'd ever be playing to beat over stuff. Your other options are Basic Insect and Komo Otoko, vanillas with 500 and 700 attack respectively.
Yeah, those
Even
are
though
still
the
pretty
Thunder
weak.
and Plant equips are also quite pointless, they at least have some slightly less worse beaters that put the insects to shame. Even then, for all of these, you'd be better off running Invigoration since they're all Earth attribute, making these cards even more pointless. With its tiny card pool, Yugi Kaiba format pretty much only had Fiend, Spellcasters, Rocks, and Beast Warriors as playable types, with Fiend being by far the best of them due to having Legend, Summon Skull, and
Yeah, Fiend type is
and
awesome.
Even so, the Fiend equip Dark Energy was still never even considered as a real option. There was just never any hope for Laser Cannon Armor, if even with all of the added context of the confines of a tiny format with only 185 cards. It's still one of the worst ones in there. And at number 4, we have the legendary Black Belt. This card can only be equipped to Chusuke the Mouse Fighter, Monk Fighter, and Master Monk. It makes it
so you're
that
limited
when
on that
monster
one
destroys
already.
something by battle and sends it to the graveyard, your opponent takes damage equal to that monster's defense. The monster who had the honor to be directly named by this card are respectively a 1200 attack vanilla, a 1300 beater that might as well be a vanilla, and a 1900 attack double attacker that can only be summoned by tributing the previous one. This card's effect would already probably be bad enough for it to make it onto this list, but it being limited to such a bad roster of monsters only drags it further down. What's even more disappointing
that really is
that
bad.
there are even more cards which support the troop of bad monsters, and this is the worst of them. Caminite Blow and Lone Wolf are not cards you'd ever want to run either, but they still put legendary Black Belt to shame. Either way, the odds of either Chusuke or Monk Fighter beating over something that matters is extremely low unless they're equipped with a bunch of other equip spells. And even if they do manage to, you're not going to get meaningful burn damage out of it. While Master Monk is at least a 1900 beater, it's pretty tough to bring out, specifically requiring you to tribute Monk Fighter beforehand. Its effect does give it 2 attacks, potentially letting you get double the payoff from Black Belt, but that's still not enough. You're ways off from matching any of the other tributes or chaos monsters of the era, and even if you're looking from it at a less meta angle, even the 2k defenders will stop you in your tracks. Leave it to this card to require a 3-card combo to be of any use and still lose to monsters from the first set of the game.
It is
And
garbage.
at number 3, we have Germ Infection. This spell decreases the attack of a non-machine type monster equipped with it by 300 during each of its standby phases. This is as close as you'll get to an equipped spell that does literally nothing. Not only is a 300 debuff pretty minor, it makes you wait a whole turn for it to even apply once. Even if
Yeah,
this
so it'd
card's
be
lack of
easy to get rid of
problem-solving
that.
context might make it unclear, it only decreases the monster's attack during each of your standby phases. So you can equip it, pass turn, and your opponent will still have their beater intact on their turn. You can't even shake it off as just a byproduct of this time, as even the other pack filler equips from the same set are better. Paralyzing Potion stops an equipped non-machine monster from attacking, which is probably what you want when using Germ Infection anyway.
Which is better.
The further you go, the more this card gets outshone by other throwaway commons no one ever wanted to pull. Shooting Star Bowl Seal can drop an opponent's attack by 1000 straight up, and Dark World Shackles turns any monster's stats into almost zero. And these still have the same problem, which is that they are generally just worse than any removal spell you could ever get your hands on. Your opponent still keeps that body, which they can use as a resource to keep it around for its other effects. Even back then, you had the option to just tribute it off, and then later on you could use it for synchros, XCs, and etc, etc. The only way for Germ Infection to ever impact a game is if you're discarding it for the cost of another card. And at number 2, we have Trial of the Princess. This card can only be equipped to with either White Magician Pikaru or Ebon Magician Kuren, and gives the monster 800 attack. During a turn in which the equipped monster beats over a level 5 or higher monster by battle, you contribute it in this equipped card to special summon either Princess Pikaru or Kuren from your hand or deck, depending on which was the equipped monster. The base form of Pikaru is a light spellcaster with 200 attack that during the standby phase gives you 400 life points for each monster you control.
I can't afford
and Kuren
that.
has the same stats and is a dark attribute and deals 300 damage to your opponent for each monster they control. These are two pretty lame monsters to have an equip spell for just themselves. Their effects are negligible and actually kind of hard to pull off, since they need to survive a whole turn and see your next standby phase with their paltry stats.
Yeah,
They're also
that-
both
yeah,
heavily
that-
classified
yeah, I can
as other
understand.
monsters in their same niche, even if you're just looking at more old and low rarity stuff. Dancing Fairy and Stealth Bird are much better stat-wise and can heal or burn for a flat 1000 each. And even those aren't
Oh,
what
yeah,
you
that's
call
much
powered
better.
cards either. The Trial of the Princess is clearly meant to make up for these weaknesses somehow, but it just
But
doesn't.
still,
An 800 attack boost does turn them into 2k beaters, but that just means you need 2 cards to do what a vanilla can do in 1. The condition this equip has to rank the girls up is also so hard to pull off it might as well not even be there. There are very few playable level 5 or higher monsters that have sub 2000 stats, with the only one that comes to mind being Air Knight Parshath, who stopped seeing play around the same time this card came out. So you'll probably need a third card to help you win a battle on top of all that, or Nightmare Archfiends to give your
so
opponent
you
a
really
high
do
level
need more
monster.
than just
And
that
for all
one
that effort,
card.
you deserve a payoff that just reads, you win the duel. But the princesses, of course, are much less than that. The evolved forms of Pikaru and Kuren just have the 800 attack boost integrated into their baseline stats, and doubles the values for their effects. The only positive thing we can say about the Trial of the Princess is that at least it's not as bad as the next card on this list. And finally, at number 1, we have Magical Labyrinth. It can only be equipped to Labyrinth
Oh,
Wall
God,
that lets you trigger it
yeah.
to summon Wall Shadow from your deck. Labyrinth Wall is a level 5 Earth Rock Vanilla monster with 0 attack and 3000 defense, and its Shadow is a level 7 Dark Warrior monster with 1600 attack and 3000 defense that can't be normaled and must only be special summoned through this card. What better way to close out the list than
It is such a convoluted summon.
Magical Labyrinth exists only as a way to turn your wall from a defender into a very mediocre beater, and it doesn't even pretend to have any other use. At least in the previous slot, the Trial of the Princess would at least slightly buff the monster's attack to justify being an equip spell.
Whereas
This does
Magical
nothing of the
Labyrinth
sort, and
does
nor do they
nothing.
have a special condition that must happen for its effect to apply, making it puzzling as to why they just make it a spell that tributes Labyrinth Wall to bring out Wall Shadow. All this ends up doing is making this combination vulnerable to both monsters and spell trap removal all at once. Not that there's much of a reason to interact with this combo anyway. As bad as Kuren or Chusuke are without their respective equips, they could at least beat over stuff and do something to progress the game state. Labyrinth Wall just sits there doing nothing, and you can't even summon it
And
for
it's
free
just a
due to its
blocker.
high level. Wall Shadow, being so terrible, only serves to rub more salt into the wound. The first starter decks give you monsters that are just as good as attacking as Wall Shadow without having to jump through any hoops to bring them out. Sure, Wall Shadow has way more defense, but if your main goal is just to use it to turtle up, why even bother with its equip in the first place? In the anime, the card was a fusion of Labyrinth and Shadow Ghoul, but they couldn't even be bothered to give it Ghoul's effect while also making it harder to summon than if it was a purple card still. Out of all of the failures of them trying to translate cool moments from the show into the actual TCG, This might just be the most embarrassing of them all.
It's a
In this
failure.
video, we'll be looking at some of the earliest sets in the game, more specifically Legacy of Darkness and Labyrinth of Nightmare, and going over the 10 worst cards from these early parts of Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 10, we have Double Snare. This is a spell card which simply has the effect where you can destroy one face-up card in the field which has an effect that negates trap card effects. So it's an incredibly specific counter to a specific type of card.
Yeah.
Although it was pretty obviously targeted at Jinzo, which is a 2400 attack level 6 monster that has the passive effect to negate all trap effects. And later on it could be used on Royal Decree since it works on any face-up card that negates trap effects and not just monsters. However,
Oh yeah,
funny
you're
enough,
gonna have to
this
get
card
specific
cannot
with
be used
that
on
one.
Trap Master, because that card does not have an effect which negates trap effects, and simply has an effect to destroy trap cards. Now, as far as incredibly specific counter cards go, it at least is usable on more targets than something like Griffin Wing, which was designed only to counter a specific card in the game. However, when this card came out, the game already had cards like Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Fissure, which could do the same job without being incredibly specific on their targets. And there was even Torrential Tribute and Bottomless Trap Hole, which were released in these two sets, which are also just better ways of destroying monster cards. Although granted, those two do not work on a card like Jinzo. Now, Jinzo did see a lot of competitive play, so chances are if you used
Of course,
Double
it's
Snare,
Jinzo.
you might have actually been able to resolve the effect, which is why it's only at the number 10 spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Cyclone Laser. This is an equip spell card which can only be equipped to a specific monster named Gradius, and it has the effect to increase its attack by 300 and granted piercing battle damage. Now, piercing battle damage at this time was kind of rare, but not unheard of, because these sets also released a card called Air Knight Parshath, which is a level 5 monster with 1900 attack, which both has piercing battle damage and allows you to draw a card if it inflicted battle damage. It was actually pretty heavily played as a staple card because it allowed you to gain immediate advantage if you successfully resolve the effect a single time, which was useful against popular staple cards like Spirit Reaper. So why wasn't Cyclone Laser good?
Because
Well,
you needed
spell cards
Gradius, and it
inherently
only
are
had
not good
300 attack.
because they're incredibly vulnerable to all types of removal. Because if the monster it's equipped to is removed from the field or simply flipped face down, then the card is sent to the graveyard, in addition to being vulnerable to spell card removal as well. And it was an incredibly specific target, which heavily limits the usefulness of the card, where they better be super good if they're going to be only usable on a single card. And Gradius is not incredibly good. It's a
No.
level 4 vanilla monster with only 1200 attack, when these two sets included a monster like Gemini Elf, which was a 1900 attack level 4 monster. So only boosting its attack up to 1500 and granting piercing damage was not really good, and would need to do a lot more than that in order to see any kind of competitive play. Especially since the sets also release powerful equip spell cards like United We Stand and Mage Power, which provide massive attack boost to any monster you equip them to, and not just incredibly specific low attack vanilla monsters. And at number 8, we have Feng Sheng Mirror. This is a spell card which has the effect where you get to look at your opponent's hand, and if they have a spirit monster in their hand, you can discard that monster to the graveyard. So if your opponent does not have a spirit monster in their hand,
That makes the
will
card
only just let
useless.
you look at your opponent's hand. Now, if you're able to resolve the effect correctly, it's not a half-bad effect. The problem is that people don't really play spirit monsters, and they weren't very heavily played when this card first came out either, despite the fact it did come out in the same set as
So
Yagarasu,
overall, it just made the card
which was
mute.
one of the longest banned cards in the game. Although part of the reason
Or moot.
Yagarasu was banned was because of a combo that would search it out of the deck anyway, and then use it in a way where a card like Feng Sheng Mirror wouldn't be able to counter it. And there were other spirit monsters that did see competitive play over the years, but only very niche amounts of it, and nowhere near enough where you'd want to run a specific counter card like Feng Sheng Mirror. So, it's never really seen any play, and probably won't unless there's some kind of really good Broken Spirit Monster support released in the future, or even then you're probably better off just running a common staple over this incredibly specific counter card. Although it does at least have a positive effect, even if it's not a very powerful effect, which cannot really be said
It's
for a lot
something.
of the higher cards on this list. And at number 7, we have Jam Breeding Machine. This is
Oh,
a
this one
continuous spell
again.
card that, while it's on the field, it basically floodgates the player who's using it, as it prevents you from summoning any monsters except for slime tokens. And then the card itself will summon a slime token, but only during your standby phase, and only one of them per turn. Although the effect is not a hard once per turn, so if you have 3 copies of Jam Breeding Machine, you'll be able to summon 3 tokens every turn. So here's the problem with this card. The beneficial effect does not take place until your next turn, since it's almost impossible to activate this card before your standby phase to gain immediate benefits. So you can avoid the negative detriments by just using this card during your main phase too, and after you've already summoned monsters for the turn, but then you're still kind of stuck with a card that's floodgating you. If you can give your opponent jam
Summon
breeding
slime
machine
tokens in
and force
attack
them to
mode, you
activate
can't
it,
summon
that's
anything
actually
else.
beneficial, which is not a good selling point of a card that you're trying to use on your own. The restrictions of locking you out of all summons just kind of defeats the purpose of summoning the tokens in the first place.
Yeah.
And if you go the route of just removing Jam Breeding Machine from the field with something like Emergency Provisions, it's also not really worth it because it only
Ooh,
summons a single token
nice.
per turn. So under best case scenarios of trying to take advantage of this card, and you use it last at the end of your main phase 2, get one token during your standby phase, and then send it to the graveyard with Emergency Provisions in order to end the floodgate on yourself and gain 1000 life points, it's basically a 2-card combo that gets you a level 1 token monster on the field, which is not worth the -1 in card advantage. However, if you instead try to stall out for as many turns as possible and gradually accumulate a lot of tokens, then use Emergency Provisions in order to send it to the graveyard later, that's really the only way to gain value from the card, as you need to get at least 2 tokens on the field to be able to pay for the cost of using Emergency Provisions and sending Jam Breeding Machine to the graveyard, which would require you to stall out for 2 whole turns, and protect your incredibly vulnerable tokens. Now, one of the benefits of the tokens summoned is that they don't have any restrictions on them, like say a Scapegoat token does. But that's about as far as the benefits go on the card. And you really have to go out of your way to make this card work for you, as it's not really good out of the gate. And it's not really worth the effort of going through the hoops in order to get the card to work for you, unless you really want to play a gimmicky Wetlands beatdown deck. And at number 6, we have Nuvia the Wicked. This is a level 4 monster with 2000 attack, which has the effect where it destroys itself on its normal summon. And with only 800 defense, it's not likely to survive being set on the field first and then flip face up. However, if it does manage to survive this convoluted summoning method, then it has another negative effect where it loses 200 attack for each monster your opponent controls. So, if your opponent has a single monster, it goes down to 1800 attack. In this same set, which had Nuvia the Wicked, Gemini Elf was also released, which was
so
a
Gemini Elf would
attached
basically
1900 attack
trounce
instant,
that one.
so it could attack over Nuvia the Wicked with its negative effect being applied. I'm not really sure why this card had 2 negative effects applied to it, when either one of them was enough in order to balance the card next to a vanilla monster like Gemini Elf. And at number 5, we have Jam Defender. This is a continuous trap card which has the effect where if your opponent declares an attack, you can redirect.
Oh, you would need a Revival Jam for this card.
Revival Jam is a 1500 attack monster, which has the effect that if it's destroyed by battle, you can pay 1000 life points to special summon it in defense position during the next standby phase. So the synergy between these 2 cards is pretty apparent. The card can bring itself back if it's destroyed, and you can use Jam Defender in order to protect your other monsters from at least 1 attack.
Well, then you'd be spending 1000 life points each time to keep Revival Jam going.
Late in order for it to be super useful, as you don't get the card back until your next turn. And it only comes back once it's destroyed by battle, so any other kind of removal will render it completely unusable, which means Jam Defender itself would be completely useless if Revival Jam is not on the field, which is the main problem of the card. It's an incredibly specific card, like Cyclone Laser, which only works on one specific monster, and the monster it works on is not easy to search out or very easy to use. If Revival Jam could come back during the battle phase, it might be useful as a way to stall out your opponent's attacks. But since it doesn't come back until your next turn, it at best stops 1 attack, and there are much better battle traps to play in the game that are not incredibly specific. And at number 4,
and don't
we
cost
have
life
Return of
points.
the Doomed. This is a spell card which has the effect where you can discard a monster card from your hand in order to return a monster from your graveyard to your hand that was destroyed as a result of battle this turn. Now, the main problem with this card is the fact that it's a normal spell card, so it can only be activated during your turn. And generally, you don't enter the battle phase under the notion that you're wanting your monsters to get destroyed by battle this turn. This kind of effect is much more useful during your opponent's turn if you really wanted to return one of those cards to your hand, which is probably not worth it because of the inherent cost of the card as well. It's a -1 in card advantage because you have to discard a monster specifically, and the activation requirement for it is only a card that you've gotten on the field in the first place and managed to get destroyed by battle, of which there are not too many cards that fit the distinction that you really want to get back to your hand at a -1 cost, when you can instead just bring out the monster from the graveyard with something like Monster Reborn or Call the Haunted, which did a much better job of getting cards back to your graveyard without making you go -1 in card advantage.
You got more
really,
sleeves than cards, my
-1 in
dude.
Card advantage, that really sets this card as kind of bad, because of
I
just
can't afford that.
important card advantage is in Yu-Gi-Oh! If this card could be used without having to discard, it still wouldn't be very useful, but it wouldn't be on this list most likely, as there's even a similar card called the Warrior Returning Alive, which was released in the same set as Return of the Doom.
That brings a warrior from the graveyard
to competitive play over the years. And that's mainly because it didn't require any cost, even if it was restricted to only warrior type monsters. And at number 3, we have Fairy Guardian. This is a monster which has the effect where you contributed in order to return a spell card from your graveyard to the bottom of your deck as long as it was sent to the graveyard this turn by your opponent. So, at least Return of the
That is
Doom
very
allows you to return the
specific.
advantage directly to your hand. Fairy Guardian kind of has the same problem of going -1 for the effect, but it's not even a useful effect. If you could
It
just
brings it
return
to the
any spell card
bottom
from your graveyard
of
to
your
the bottom
deck.
of the deck with its effect without any other kind of conditions, it would still be bad. The fact that it requires a target that was sent to the graveyard by your opponent makes it laughably bad. It's basically a vanilla monster with how useless that effect is, and it doesn't even have good stats with 1000 attack and defense on a level 3 monster. Now, there are 3 other cards which were created in the same vein and released in the sets, but at least those ones had better stats. The Forgiving Maiden contributed itself in order to return a monster destroyed by battle to your hand, similar to Return of the Doom. But it at least had 2000 defense, which was a useful stat line for a level 4 or lower monster.
Very
Lady
good.
Panther contributed itself in order to return a destroyed monster by battle to the top of your deck, and Crimson Sentry contributed itself to return a monster destroyed by battle to the bottom of your deck, and both of these cards were equally terrible, as they didn't even return the card to your hand like the Forgiving Maiden did, nor did they have noteworthy stats. Although even they are better than Fairy Guardian, because activating the effects is actually more likely to happen, because the trigger of a monster being destroyed by battle is much easier to set up and see in a common game than the trigger of your opponent sending one of your spell cards to the graveyard during your turn. Because to make matters worse, all of these effects are spell speed 1 and thus only usable during your turn. So,
Yeah,
how could anything be worse than
it's
Fairy
slow.
Guardian? Well, at least it can be used as a vanilla beatstick, without losing you a whole bunch of advantage. And at number 2, we have a dual spot with Super Robo Lady and Super Robo Yaru. These are 2 level 6 fusion
Oh, I remember
monsters
those.
with only 1200 attack, and they both have the effect where they can return themselves from the field to the extra deck in order to special summon the other one from the extra deck, but not on the same turn that they were special summoned to the field. And then they both have different kinds of effects when attacking, where Super Robo Lady gains 1000 attack if it's attacking directly, and Super Robo Yaru gains 1000 attack if it's battling a monster. And of those 2 effects, Super Robo Yaru does have a more useful one, because it means it can actually beat over something like a Gemini Elf. Now, what's bad about these cards is that they're early game fusion monsters and have 2 incredibly weak vanilla monsters as their
They
materials.
stink.
And also, when they were released, there wasn't really fusion support to help get these cards in your hand in order to actually perform the fusion summons in the first place. You basically had to rely on hard drawing the 2 materials and a polymerization, and going -2 in card advantage in order to bring out one of the 2 fusion monsters. And for going -2 in order to bring out one of these 2 cards, they definitely did not do enough on the field to really justify the amount of investment required to bring them out. Although, to be fair, neither did most of the early game fusions. And also, their ability to tag out with each other was not even good because you couldn't actually do it until your next turn, and it was a spell speed 1 effect. So they were both level 6 fusion monsters that were technically targets for Fusion Weapon, which I know some people in the comments might mention as a benefit of it, which would provide a 1500 attack boost. Although that card wasn't released until a year later, and wasn't a better attack boost than just United We Stand or Mage Power, which was
So there was no
available
help
at
from
their
that one.
release. They could also be brought out with Power Bond to double their attack since they're machine-type fusion monsters, but that doesn't really solve the problem of them still not having the consistency tools needed in order to pull that off without going -2 in card advantage. However, 5 years after they were released, they did introduce a specific support card for them called Cybernetic Zone, which on a quick play spell card allowed you to banish a machine-type fusion monster until the end of the turn, and when it returned to the field it had its attack doubled, but then it was destroyed during the next standby phase. And since these 2 cards could tag out with each other,
Yeah, but still,
you
that
could
was
use
years
Cybernetic Zone
later.
to protect them during your opponent's turn, get a 2400 attack monster with their benefits during your turn, and then tag it out during the main phase 2 in order to prevent them from being destroyed. And even this combo was not worth the effort, but at least there was a useful application of their ability to tag out with each other now. And at least they could somewhat be useful, despite the massive amount of card disadvantage you incurred. And at number 1, we have Chosen One. This is a spell card which requires you to select 3 cards in your hand, 1 monster and 2 non-monster cards, then your opponent randomly chooses one of the 3 cards. If the chosen card is a monster card, it's special summoned and you send the other 2 cards to the graveyard. If it's not the monster, you instead send all the cards to the graveyard. So basically, you have a chance to go -3 in order to special summon a monster from your hand.
That is very
Or
much
you
not
have
worth
a
it.
2/3 chance of going -4 for no effect. If this card could just special summon that monster from your hand with the same cost, without the random chance, it would still be terrible. The fact that you have a less than 50% chance of actually being able to summon the monster just makes it that much worse. In fact, this card is so bad, it's probably one of the worst cards ever made, which probably wasn't
I wouldn't be
specifically
surprised.
designed to be bad, like Cold Feet or Jar of Generosity. It's really saying something when a card is worse than Cold Feet. a card that was made as a joke in order to lampoon a banned card, where the easiest way to affix Chosen One would be to simply make it so you don't discard the 2 non-monster cards when you use the effect, or discard any of the cards ever. If its ability lets you special summon the monster from your hand if it was chosen, and then leave the other 2 cards in your hand, it would be a perfectly average, mediocre gamble card.
It would have been
And on
fine.
a failure state, if it just lets you keep all the cards in your hand, it would still be an average, mediocre card. The fact that you lose all of the card advantage in either scenario is what easily makes this one of the worst cards on this list. It would probably be in the top 10 of just worst cards of all time as well. In this video, we'll look at some of the worst cards from the first 2 sets of the game, a time period in Yu-Gi-Oh! That has some of the most broken cards ever printed, as well as some of the most terrible. And at number 10, we have Harpy Lady Sisters. This is a level 6 monster with 1950 attack. And
It is a somewhat strong monster that requires too much to summon it.
Elegant Egotist card, and can't be normal summoned or sent. Luckily, Elegant Egotist is actually a good card, as it has the effect where if you control a Harpy Lady on the field, you can special summon another Harpy Lady or Harpy Lady Sisters from your hand or deck. So, if you're able to get
So
Harpy
you're better
Lady
off
on the
just
field,
summoning a
then you
different
can
Harpy
use
Lady
Elegant
that has
Egotist
better
in order to
attack,
special summon
defense,
Harpy Lady
and better
Sisters
stats
directly from your
overall.
deck. And for being a card that you can get out of your deck, 1950 in stats is not half bad. Especially when one of the strongest level 4 monsters in the game at the time was La Jin, the mystical genie of the lamp, which only had 1800 attack. However, there were a couple of problems with Harpy Lady Sisters that contributed to the card never seeing any competitive play, despite the fact that it could be cheated out of the deck. One of those was that Harpy Lady herself is pretty weak for a level 4 monster at only 1300 attack, and Elegant Egotist was unsearchable at the time. So the combo in order to pull off Harpy Lady into Harpy Lady Sisters was just not a consistent one, and since Harpy Lady Sisters has the detriment where it can't be summoned in other ways, it was basically a dead card in your hand unless you could specifically get out one named card in the field and had another named card in your hand to activate. Generally, cards which require 2 card combos in order to bring out that have
Were
no
not
good
worth
ways
it.
to search out either of those combo pieces are not very consistent, which is why the next cards also failed for having a similar detriment with their unsearchable next card. However, there was support released later on that allowed you to search out Elegant Egotist, and Harpy Ladies as an archetype evolved to the point where almost all of their main deck monsters have an effect to change their name to Harpy Lady while on the field. So with being able to actually search out Elegant Egotist pretty easily, and being able to fulfill the condition to use the card easier, Harpy Lady Sisters still didn't see any competitive play, because it was better to just bring out another Harpy Lady than Harpy Lady Sisters. Because
Yeah.
Harpy Lady Sisters still had the detriment where it was a dead card in your hand if you drew into it, and wasn't really better than just going into one of the plethora of other Harpy Lady monsters, where you'd usually bring out Harpy Lady 1 or Cyber Harpy Lady. Which is funny because there's a lot of really good Harpy support that specifically requires a level 5 or higher Harpy Lady monster on the field to gain their extra effects. And even then, they still won't use Harpy Lady Sisters, because it's easier to go into their Synchro monster instead by just playing all their level 4 Harpy Lady monsters. So, even though they specifically created support that basically forced people to use Harpy Lady Sisters, that still didn't pan out. So it never
Nope.
saw any competitive play back in the day, and not in modern Harpy Lady decks either. And yet this card is still the best card on this list by a mile, which is why it's only at the number 10 spot. And at number 9, we have Fusionist. This is a level 3 fusion monster with 900
Oh,
attack and
yeah,
700
it's-
defense.
It is
which
a weak
important to
fusion.
mention because its total stats is actually less than the total stats of one of its materials. In order to bring out Fusionist normally, you have to use Polymerization plus Petite Angel and Mystic Sheep number 2. So already you have to go -2 in card advantage to hard bring this card out. However,
For something
if
much
you
worse.
look at Mystic Sheep number 2, it has 800 attack and 1000 defense. If you add those two values together and compare those to the values of Fusionist added together, it actually has 200 more stats total. The only advantage you have for going into Fusionist is that Fusionist has 100 more attack, which is still really bad at only 900 baseline. And this wasn't exactly uncommon for early fusion monsters. There's 3 others that also have stats lower than one of their materials added up. It's just Fusionist is the weakest of all of them, and was in one of the first 2 sets, so it makes it in this video. There's a
Yeah.
reason no one really played fusion monsters in the early days of the game. You had to
They were
inherently
bad.
go -2 in order to bring one out because the only fusion spell card was Polymerization. To the point where there were special rules in the rulebook dedicated to showing how Polymerization worked. So because of that, they didn't actually print the effect on the card in the first printing of Polymerization. and none of the fusion monsters were really worth going into anyway, because they were overly balanced, because they thought being able to special summon a monster from the extra deck was just too good. And honestly, they were completely right about that, if you look at the modern metagame that is 90% dedicated around the extra deck. Although, they were a little bit too weak, and Fusionist is kind of the poster child of that bunch. Fusionist did see competitive play later on in its life as an instant fusion target, and because it was one of the few level 3 fusion monsters in the game, and a lot of old school vanilla fusion monsters saw play because they just had the perfect type or level and were instant fusion targets, like Kaminari attack. But
So
in the
they were
context of
out
old
basically
Yu-Gi-Oh! Classic sets,
for the not right
Fusionist was
purpose.
a pretty bad card, especially if you remember that La Jin was the strongest normal summon in the game, which had 1800 attack, which really puts Fusionist's 900 attack into perspective about how bad that actually was. And at number 8, we have Blast Juggler. This is a level 3 monster with only 800 attack, which has the effect that if this card has managed to stay alive face up on your side of the field until your next standby phase, you can offer this card as a tribute to select and destroy 2 face-up monsters that have 1000 or less attack. So, being able to tribute yourself to destroy 2 monsters is not half bad. It's actually a +1 in card advantage. The problem with the cards are pretty obvious, but I'll spell them out for you. The card itself is very weak, and trying to protect this card for a full turn in order to use it on your next turn is really not worth the effort of only destroying 2 low attack monsters. Generally, priority targets are high attack monsters because it's rather easy to beat over a monster with 1000 or less attack. Unless it was something like Spirit Reaper at the time, which was one of the few battle immune monsters in the early game. Although, in the early sets alongside Blast Juggler, we also had cards like Dark Hole, Raigeki, and Mirror Force, which
much better
destroy
cards
all of
that
your
didn't take much to destroy,
regardless of their attack point value. And these 3 cards were powerful, each one of them being banned or limited at some point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. But early Yu-Gi-Oh also had Fissure and Trap Hole, 2 other cards that could trade evenly 1 for 1 and much better value. The Trap Hole worked on monsters with 1000 or more attacks, so it was actually pretty good. The complete reversal of Blast Juggler. And there were other monsters which could actually destroy other monsters in the game at the time, with Man-Eater Bug probably being one of the most famous examples. So I guess they thought the effect on a monster would be too strong, so they heavily limited it with Blast Juggler. Although they went kinda crazy with the Spell and Trap cards because Dark Hole and Raigeki saw play all the way into the modern era, only really falling into favor once Lightning Storm was printed. And at number 7, we have Electric Lizard. This is a level 3 monster with 850 attack, so another really low attack point monster, which has the effect that if a non-zombie type monster attacks Electric Lizard, it cannot attack on its following turn. So basically, it has the effect to die to one opponent's monster attack, and then allow that monster to not attack on its next turn, which is technically a positive effect. Although generally, if you're going to be playing a really weak monster like Electric Lizard, you kind of want it to provide more than just stalling out one attack from one monster on the subsequent turn. And it was also funny how it didn't work on zombie-type monsters. This is kind of a theme for early Yu-Gi-Oh cards where there were certain types of monsters that had resistances to certain types of effects. Like how Steel Scorpion didn't work on machine-type monsters, for example. But Electric Lizard's effect was technically positive and did proc if it was attacked face down even. So technically, it could be used in a deck as a form of stalling, if your opponent destroyed it with one of their high-priority target monsters anyway. Although, it may surprise you to hear this, but this card actually never saw any competitive play. And at number 6, we have Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts. This is a level 6 monster with 1800 attack, which has the effect that if a specific named card is face up on the field, it gains 100 attack and defense. And then, as long as that specific monster
what was that, the Castle of Dark Illusion,
another 100 attack and defense during each of your standby phases for 4 turns. So that's a really convoluted way of saying that this card gains 500 attack if you have the Castle of Dark Illusions on the field, which means after 5 turns, for the low price of a tribute summon and having a specific name monster on the field before it hits the field,
it takes way too much to power that up.
Almost as strong as a Summoned Skull, which was the best tribute summon in the same time period, that just had a default 2500 attack on a level 6 monster. However, it could be boosted even further through the effect of Castle of Dark Illusions, as that card had the effect that if it was flipped face up, you got to increase the attack and defense of all zombie-type monsters in the field by 200 points. And then again during each of your standby phases for 4 turns afterwards. And since Pumpkin, the King of Ghosts, is zombie, it can benefit from the effects of Castle of Dark Illusions and gain an additional 800 attack after 4 turns. If you manage to bring out Pumpkin before the first standby phase after that card was flipped face up, which was technically possible with Ultimate Offering. However, it wasn't really worth playing Pumpkin the King of Ghosts for a multitude of reasons. For one, it has the same problem as Harpy Lady Sisters, in that you need a nearly unsearchable specific monster on your side of the field first before you can use it. But it isn't even special summoned from the deck like Harpy Lady Sisters is, as you still have to go through the effort of tribute summoning the card normally. And it has no inherent protection, so it dies very easily to the plethora of good spell and trap cards in the early era of the game. And also it takes forever to actually get to a good attack point value, where even back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh, taking 5 turns to almost get a summoned skull as stats
5
was
turns.
If the card didn't
That is
require
way
a
too
specific
long.
card to be on the field to gain its attack boost, it would still be too slow a card to play Yu-Gi-Oh. That's the reason they kind of abandon mechanics that take multiple turns to resolve, unless it's attached to a super good effect. And only gaining 100 attack and defense on a low statted high level monster is not a super good effect. And at number 5, we have Two-Pronged Attack. This is a trap card which requires you to destroy 2 of your monsters in order to destroy one of your opponents, which is a straight -2 in card advantage, but in one of the worst possible ways. You see, this card requires you to get 2 monsters on the field first, which requires you to use resources in order to accomplish that in the first place. So unless
Yeah, with that, you're wasting cards just to destroy something.
a significant amount of advantage in order to meet the requirements of this card. Plus, all you're doing is destroying a single one of your opponent's monsters, and you're losing a card using the trap card for Two-Pronged Attack in the first place. So you lose 3 cards on your side of the field to trade for one of your opponents. And again, this card came out when we had stuff like Dark Hole, Mirror Force, and even Fissure, which was a straight 1-for-1 trade. The only advantage Two-Pronged Attack had over Fissure was being able to select any monster you want, and of course being a trap card so it could be used to disrupt plays during your opponent's turn. But there wasn't really complicated plays to disrupt back in the day, and having to get 2 cards in the field first in order to even use it was kind of bad. The card would actually be better if it required you to discard 2 cards to use the effect instead of destroying 2 cards, because at least you don't have to dedicate resources to get those cards from your hand onto the field first. And at number 4, we have Tainted Wisdom. This is a level 3 monster with 1250 attack, so kind of low, but higher than a lot of the other cards in this we talked about so far. And what it does is if this attack position card is changed to face up defense position, you gain the wonderful effect of shuffling your deck. Now,
and that's
the beneficial uses of shuffling your deck include nothing. There is no real reason to shuffle your deck, as you don't actually gain a mechanical benefit from doing it. It's just technically kind of a positive effect, although it could be detrimental if you have something on top of your deck that you put there yourself. Tainted Wisdom could have an effect to just once per turn shuffle your deck and it would still be bad. The fact that you have to specifically change its battle position in order to activate the effect is why it's on this list. Tainted Wisdom was also released alongside other cards with battle-changing related effects, like Dream Clown, which for the same condition got to destroy one of your opponent's monsters, and Crass Clown, which had the reverse effect where if it was changed from defense position to attack position, you got to bounce one of your opponent's monsters. Both of these cards actually had good effects on their
Oh my god, this dude is just buying the card I bought from him.
In clown control decks, although they definitely did not include Tainted Wisdom, because the only positive thing about that card is the fact that it's
You saw me buy the card from you for like $88. You're buying it for nearly $120.
We have Yadokaru.
Oh my god, that is funny.
900 attack and 1700 defense, which also has a battle position change in effect, where if this card is changed from attack position to phase up defense position, you can place any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your deck in any order that you desire.
Oh my god,
now,
dude.
This is a purely detrimental effect, as it can allow you to go minus in card advantage for no effect, and also requires you to change the battle position of the card in the first place to even use it. So at least
making money off these fools.
Actively screwing yourself over by activating the effect of shuffling your deck. But just losing cards from your hand back into your deck for no reason is just really bad. One of the worst cards in the game is Pot of Generosity, and that's because it's just a -3 in card advantage. And Yadokaru can allow you to go -5 in card advantage if you desire. And the only reason this card isn't the number 1 on this list is because it has 1700 defense. You see, the strongest level 4 monster at the time was La Jin, who could beat over Yadokaru in battle if you set the card first. However, the second strongest monsters only had 1700 attack, and La Jin, the Mystical Genie of the Lamp, wasn't hitting the field all the time. Generally, you'd be facing a lot of the second strongest monsters, which Yadokaru could actually wall out. And being able to wall out monsters in order to live for 1 turn so that you can tribute the card in order to bring out something like Summon Skull was a viable strategy back in the day. and since its defense value was just high enough to maybe be useful, it's only at the number 3 spot on this list, since the top 2 spots were a lot more useless. And at number 2, we have Gate Guardian. This is a level 11 monster with a very high attack point value of 3750, which has the effect that basically
Oh yeah,
details
I
its
remember
summoning
Gate
condition
Guardian.
just like Harpy Lady Sisters, except is nowhere near as easy to summon, as you have to attribute 3 specific named monsters on your side of the field. And these 3 monsters are all level 7 monsters that can't bring themselves out easily, so it requires a whole
Plus,
bunch
separately,
of
they
resources
have
to get
very
those
good
3 cards on the
effects.
field. And as I've explained earlier with Pumpkin the King of Ghosts and Harpy Lady Sisters, getting a single named specific monster on the field first in order to activate an effect is difficult. Getting 3 high-level ones on the field is way harder. But to the benefit of Gate Guardian, its 3 materials are all actually good on their own. They all have an effect where if they're attacked by a monster, they can lower the attack of the monster to 0 permanently, so they're basically
Permanently,
guaranteed to
which
get
is very
destroyed
good.
if they're attacked into. They can only use this effect once while they're face up on the field, but you only really have to use it once. And because its materials are technically useful level 7 monsters, Gate Guardian isn't at the number 1 on this list, because it's also one of the best targets for Zubababa General, who can use this card in order to gain 3750 attack. And at number 1, we have Great Moth. This is a level 8 monster with 2600 attack, which has the effect that's basically just conditions on how the card can be summoned, just like Gate Guardian and Harpy Lady Sisters, where it can
But
only be
Great
special summoned
Moth
by
is
attributing
not
a
very
Petite
good.
Moth on the 4th of your turns after Petite Moth has been equipped with the Cocoon of Evolution. Petite
Yeah,
Moth
it's got
is
a
level 1
difficult
normal monster
summoning.
with only 300 attack and 200 defense. That doesn't do anything on its own. And Cocoon of Evolution is a level 3 monster with 2000 defense, which can equip itself from your hand to a Petite Moth on your side of the field, where it grants its original attack and defense to that Petite Moth, which means you can make Petite Moth's defense become 2000. And then you need to have Great Moth in your hand on your 4th turn after just waiting around for Petite Moth being equipped with Cocoon of Evolution on the field. Now, there's a whole lot wrong with all of this. First of all, you can only equip Cocoon of Evolution to Petite Moth while it's face up on the field, which means in order to activate it on your 1st turn in order to get the ball rolling, Petite Moth is going to have to be in an attack position with
Making
0
it a
attack,
very easy
since
target.
Cocoon of Evolution replaces its original attack with its own, which is 0. So, if you wanted to get Petite Moth on the field in defense position, in order to have 2000 defense with Cocoon of Evolution's effect, you'd have to protect it for a turn and put it in defense position, or special summon it with something like Monster Reborn in defense position. So at the get-go, it's already kind of difficult to just set up the combo because it's ridiculously vulnerable. And then you also have to protect it for 4 turns, which, as I've described in the Pumpkin King of Ghosts sections,
Takes too long.
is very difficult with how strong early spell and trap card removal was. And then you need to have a Great Moth in your hand during the 4th turn after you equip it with Petite Moth and Cocoon of Evolution, which means you need to have found a way to search it out by then and can only be brought out on the 4th of your turns. So if it's the 5th of your turns after equipping it, then the effect is no longer live and you can't bring out Great Moth. And that's not even to mention the fact that Petite Moth and Cocoon of Evolution require named cards working with each other, which requires searching those cards out in order to get the combo started in the first place. Now, there are 2 other cards that can be brought out on different turns, with Larva Moth probably being the worst of them all, because it has all of the same terrible conditions as Great Moth, but only has 500 attack, which actually makes this kind of one of the worst cards in the game, period. Because not only is Larva Moth bad on its own, the fact that it requires all of the convoluted requirements of Great Moth in order to accomplish its bad stats is kind of hilariously bad. But at least you only need to wait 2 turns in order to bring out Larva Moth instead of 4. And there's also a mega version called Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth, which can be brought out on the 6th turn or later with the same conditions as the other 2 cards. And
So
at least
even
Perfectly
longer.
Ultimate Great Moth can be brought out on the 6th turn or later instead of exactly on the 6th turn like the previous 2 cards. However, Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth didn't come out until later and wasn't actually released alongside the original 4-card package.
So it doesn't count.
Really, this spot should be just the whole archetype of the Petite Moth and the Cocoon of Evolutions, because the whole system of how this works is just another example of them trying out mechanics of having cards wait around for a couple of turns before they realized the speed of the game was just too fast for these kinds of cards to ever properly resolve. And the cards that they brought out after all of that waiting around were just not worth the effort, especially since they were essentially vanilla monsters that just acted as big beat sticks. Later on, they did try this mechanic again with the ultimate insect monsters, although that archetype failed for a different reason, but at least it was better than the Cocoon of Evolution mechanic. And also, as a side note, much later on they printed a trap card called Corrosive Scales, which basically gives an insect-type monster the effect that Great Moth was supposed to have from its anime appearance, of lowering the
Oh.
attack of your opponent's monsters. If the moth had the effect of corrosive scales built into it baseline, it would still be bad and not worth being played because of the mechanic of Cocoon of Evolution. Although, they did release the spell card Cocoon of Ultra Evolution, which can allow you to cheat the card out directly from your deck, as kind of a way to finally let people play the card if they really wanted to in an actual duel. But even then, you're better off bringing out the reprinted Insect Queen card instead. The most sought after rewards for doing well at the big Yu-Gi-Oh tourneys has always been undoubtedly the prize cards. TCG cards not only go for a lot of money, but they're also often unavailable for the rest of the player base for quite a while up until they get a reprint. On today's episode of the unknown side of Yu-Gi-Oh, we'll be going over the SGC prize cards, as well as the impact they've had in the game due to their power and exclusivity. The first card we'll be going over is Cyberstein. This is a level 2 Dark Machine monster with meager stats, but its effect lets you pay 5,000 life points to special summon any fusion monster from your extra deck in attack position.
Which is
Cyberstein
absurd.
was the first unique prize card we got, all the way back in 2004. Back then, the main Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments were still the Shonen Jump Championship Series, or SJCs. These were the only official large-scale events for the game and were held throughout the USA and Canada. Because there was not yet an equivalent for these tourneys in Europe in 2004, Stein was only exclusive to the winners of a few tournaments. It was also exclusive to America, despite having been released originally as a common all the way back in '99 for the OCG. Stein saw some play in Japan due to being one of the first few ways to access the extra deck. But due to its staggered release in the West, it actually didn't have any impact as a prize card at first. This is because both Metamorphosis and Magical Scientist were available by the time Stein was released, and they did a better job at utilizing the good fusion monsters from the time, especially Thousand Eyes Restrict, without a 5,000 life point cost. Still, in the following years, not only would these options get banned, but Cyberstein would also become available to the player base at large due to a reprint. However, as if this wouldn't be enough to make it playable, we would also see the release of the two best Stein targets only a month after that, Cyber End Dragon and Cyber Twin Dragon.
Ooh,
These two
yeah.
were both beaters with huge stats that could pierce and attack twice respectively, allowing you to go for game out of nowhere. From this point on, Stein would begin to see play in almost every deck, with Cyberstein OTK being a strategy that used the card as its main win con. The goal was to stall the game floodgates like Level Limit Area B and Gravity Bind up until they could draw a back row sweeper, Stein, and something to make Stein represent lethal, at which point they'd just clear the field and go for lethal. It also became somewhat popular around this time for burn decks to play a 15-card Cyberstein OTK conversion package into their side deck. Since both that deck and the burn shared the same floodgates, they could easily transform their whole strategy for games 2 and 3, which would make side decking against them extremely difficult. However, though these two weren't the only things around in the metagame, Cyberstein was still a factor in almost every deck. Most players would have at least a single copy to their main, since it was a valid search target for Sandgan and could be special summoned to the field very easily through either Premature Burial or Last Will. This meant that any random deck could very well turn any small lead into game by bringing out a huge threat when their opponent had no interaction. This went on for about a year, but it seems the last straw for Konami was when a dedicated Stein strategy took a 2006 Shonen Jump Championship by storm, at which point they decided to ban this card in an unprecedented emergency ban list.
For
where
good
it was
reason.
actually the only hit. This means this is not only the first prize card, but it's also the first card to be emergency banned as well. This card stayed banned for well over 10 years, only being brought down to limited in 2019, where we would see some experimentation.
2019, jeez.
Even though it now has a target as powerful as Nature Exterio, which can negate all spells and traps your opponent activates, it wasn't worth dedicating an extra deck slot for this one of, which took up your normal summon. Stein would pick up some steam when Tear Limits were around though, since it could be milled through chance through some of the regular plays, and then brought back from the graveyard with Sprite Elf, and then it could either bring out a Tear Fusion or the aforementioned Exterio. This was good enough to earn itself a spot in quite a few topping lists, but of course this stopped when Sprite Elf as well as Tear Limits in general were annihilated by the ban list. Nowadays, this card's only remaining niche outside of Jengi FTKs is in a few machine decks where it can be searched off of Gear Giant X, and it might see play in Super Heavy Samurais once their new support drops. Even if it did not see much play before its reprint, this card's power and extensive history do make it more than worth being the first SJC prize card. The second prize card we got in the West was Des Volscalf. This is a level 6 Earth Dragon with 2200 attack and 1700 defense, with the ability to inflict 500 damage to your opponent if it destroys an opponent's monster by battle. Additionally, each time a normal or quick play spell card resolves, it gains 200 attack until the end phase. It was in the year that Volscalf came out that Konami would attempt to have an SJC equivalent for Europe, the Pharaoh Tour, which would be held in the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, and France. This was great news for the European players at the time, even if the prize card's quality wouldn't begin to match such a feat. Even for its time, Des Volscalf was one of the most underwhelming tribute summons you could be making, as things like Monarchs and Jinzos were already available to everyone. This card's mediocre burn effect, coupled with a very minor attack boost, could make it into a playground staple at best. even though it was only available to the
That's
high-level
fair.
competition for a long while. This one remained a prize card exclusive for almost 5 years before getting a commercially available printing, though this had zero impact on the game whatsoever. Still, this would end up being one of the only duds when it came to the SJC era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Prize cards, being
Oh well.
the only card on the list whose sole quality was being hard to obtain back then, and having no reason to be liked outside of its brief appearance in the anime. Next up for 2006, we have Shrink. This is a quick play spell card
Shrink.
which lets you target a face-up card in the field and make its attack become half its original value for this turn. Shrink was a pretty decent staple for its time as a heavily power-crept version of other attack-changing effects. Battle traps like
Shrink's
Cypress
a fun
Arbor
card.
had been seen a lot of play by the time this card was released, and though Shrinks filled a similar role, it was also much more versatile. It could be used both when attacking and being attacked, could be chained to backward removal, and triggered during the damage step. The main problem behind this card was its synergy with Don Zalug and Hydrogen Dawn, both cards with pretty good effects if they win a battle. While Shrink does go pretty well with these cards, this single copy of it some top players had wasn't enough to boost these kind of strategies further than others, meaning the impact of the card being so exclusive was minimal. However, this wouldn't stop this card from being hyped by the player base at large, who eagerly awaited for a proper release. In early 2007, this card became available to everyone, and in that same year we would see the first strategy to be heavily associated with it, the gadgets. These monsters all had small bodies, with the biggest one maxed out at 1400, but they all shared the effect to add the gadget that matched their background color from the deck to the hand. They were all +1 to normal summon, which would then add another +1 on the following turn, something that had never been seen before in the game's history, and quickly became one of the most popular strategies around. Gadget decks had to max on all kinds of 1-for-1 removal, as their monsters would rarely, if ever, contest anything by themselves. And this is where Shrink shone. It allowed all gadgets to at least trade in battle even with the biggest monsters that were seen play, the Monarchs. Not only they'd often max out on Shrink, they'd often play the strictly inferior Rush Recklessly in addition to it as well. In the following years, just as the gadgets began to fall off, we got Gladiator Beast, another archetype which benefited greatly from this card. All the Glad Beast monsters get their effects off at the end of the battle phase if they've battled that turn, with these ranging from removal to generating advantage. This meant that the usual battle traps like Dimension Prison were often subpar in Gladiator Beast decks, as they'd much prefer to run Waboku and Shrink instead, letting you trigger your Glads even during your opponent's turn. This would be the last hurrah for this card, as from this point on, the battle phase would only become less and less relevant with time. Even if this card's relevancy
$68
with prize card
card
exclusive had been minimal, Konami would not disappoint the players with what came afterwards. Crush Card Virus would then be the prize card of choice from January to July of 2007. This is a normal
Crush
trap
card.
whose pre-errata effect lets you tribute a dark monster with 1000 or less attack to destroy all monsters with 1500 more attack from their hand, field, and also all cards they drew for the next 3 turns. Crush Card Virus was a truly broken card for its time.
It is
and
powerful.
The meta cannot be understated. Monsters with at least 1500 attack made up the majority of the metagame, accounting for a large variety of staples, such as Cyber Dragons, Monarchs, Snipe Hunter, Chaos Monsters, etc., etc. And as if getting rid of every possible threat your opponent had wasn't enough, it could also give you full hand knowledge for the next 3 turns as well, as your opponent would have to show you their hand as well as everything they drew from battle. Resolving Crush Card Virus would almost always lead to a win. This made many people start building around the card, even as a one-of. This meant including more and more targets in their deck, such as Gravekeeper's Guard and Spear Reaper, as games were slow enough to the point where you'd be able to see this card at least once a match. Diamond Dew Turbo was one of the most powerful decks around when this card's released, and this card only bolstered it further as one of their best cards. The pre-errata Disc Commander was also a fodder target for Crush Card Virus. This card led to the rich get richer kind of situation going around in the game, where people who'd won events before would have a higher chance to win future ones due to having Crush Card Virus. This would go on for the entirety of 2007, and would culminate in one of the few high-profile teams having access to this card, which they would of course only share amongst themselves. People were already complaining about the game being prohibitively expensive back then, but things would get much worse now, as Crush Card Virus was going from anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000.
Good lord.
In 2008, when people would often want to combo Crush Card Virus with another prize card, Gold Sarcophagus, totaling in over $5,000 for 2 cards out of your 40-card deck. At this point, Dark
damn, that's
Turbo
expensive.
decks were dominating the metagame, and with that itself being a $200 card on release, the game had never been, and will hopefully never again be as expensive as it was then. Things would get somewhat
Hopefully
better
not.
as Crush Card got a reprint that year, but due to some supposed short printing, this card would still be costing you over $100 by itself. What followed was a whole year of Crush Card Virus omnipresence. Towards the middle of 2008, the meta would coalesce between Gladiator Beast, Lightsworn, and Dad decks, all of which played Crush Card Virus, and also lost extremely hard to it. We would see the years close with Teledad rising up as the best deck, and the card remained legal for the first half of 2009 before it was finally banned. Crush Card Virus was a real blight for the game from release all the way to this point. And though the worst thing about it was the time when it was an exclusive prize card, it had impacted several metas after that. Konami would eventually bring back Crush Card Virus with an errata in 2015 though. The card's new effect was much like the original one, except it would also prevent your opponent from taking damage until the end of the next turn after this card resolves, and also let your opponent destroy up to 3 monsters with 1500 more attack from their deck as part of its effect. This card was still strong in 2015, but it wasn't the instant win against everything but it used to be. Around this time, both Shadows and Burning Abyss were part of the metagame, each of which had pretty good Crush Card Virus targets within their card pool. However, all other monsters would also float on destruction, making the card not nearly as powerful when it resolved. Not only that, but since the new errata would let you essentially Foolish Burial for 3, this meant getting hit by the new Crush Card Virus would more often be a plus than anything else. Still, the card was by no means bad, as there was quite a few strategies which would get destroyed by it, such as Necroz and Cleafort. This made Crush Card Virus go from an instant win button to a good side deck staple and nothing more. As the years passed, not only did graveyard effects become more prominent, but better side deck cards with easier activation requirements had become more popular, which would eventually make this card leave the meta and never come back again. Crush Card Virus remains as the strongest and most controversial prize card in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, which put the game in such a state that hopefully won't ever repeat itself again. The second prize card for 2007 was Gold Sarcophagus. This is a normal spell card which banishes 1 card from your deck when activated, and then adds it to your hand during the second standby phase after it was activated. Despite North America getting Crush Card Virus in the first half of the year, and then Gold Sarcophagus during the second half, this was actually the only prize card available in Europe during 2007, as they would skip on Crush Card Virus entirely until its reprint. This would also be the last one to be available on the content for a while, as the Pharaoh Tour, which gave out Gold Sarcophagus, was also the last one that took place. Either way, Gold Sarcophagus was yet another amazing staple from the time, locked behind either doing really well at a huge tourney or a crazy prize tag. Being able to search for anything in your deck was more than worth waiting for 2 turns. This was often used in conjunction with Crush Card Virus like previously mentioned, but it wasn't uncommon to go into your boss monster or any other similarly limited cards. Being yet another option which every deck at the time would run if they could, Gold Sarcophagus offered a huge advantage to those who had access to it. This card would end up getting its reprint in 2009. With Crush Card Virus banned by this point, this was still a good card, but which would only see play in decks that actually had something worth waiting 2 turns for. It was most popular in Lightsworn at first, since it was one of the best ways to get their boss monster, Judgment Dragon. This card would go on to also become a staple in X-Sabers, since the then limited Rescue Cat was one of the deck's best enablers, and countless other decks
Rescue Cat,
where it began to fall off. However, just as it became a tad too slow to wait 2 turns for anything, we also got cards with effects that triggered when they're banished. The Dragon Rulers were the first, but also one of the best at doing this. Each ruler gets you an add off of being banished, making Gold Sarcophagus into a Rhoda, with the added benefits 2 turns later. This would lead to Gold Sarcophagus being put on the limited list again, where it would still be run as a one-off in pretty much every list that ran Dragon Rulers. In 2015, this same year that Crush Card Virus came back to the meta through its errata, so would Gold Sarcophagus due to the new Dex release at the time. Both the Ritual Beast and Cosmos like having their monsters banished, making Gold Sarcophagus into a must-have. Eventually, in 2016, they unlimited the card. In the later parts of the year, it ended up becoming an important staple in certain decks. This was because of Shiranui Solitaire and Shiranui Spirit Master, which let you either special summon your banished Shiranuis and pop an opponent's card when banished respectively. When coupled with Giant Rex, which special summoned itself for free when banished, this meant that Gold Sarcophagus was a full toolbox by itself. This card would be allowed to take on this role up until the Thunder Dragon support came out, which had much stronger effects than banished, such as special summoning from the deck or adding any card from their archetype to their hand. This led to Gold Sarcophagus being put to 1 again, where it's been ever since. Even if the original reason why this card got hit might no longer be relevant, Gold Sarcophagus is still a great card that sees play as recently as this year due to its synergy with Despia as well. Overall, even if it might not have been impactful as Crush Card Virus back in its heyday, Gold Sarcophagus
it's still a really good card
as the prize card which has seen the biggest amount of play throughout the years. It and Cyberstein are the only cards in this list to be limited to this day, and it's unlikely we'll ever see Gold Sarcophagus back at 3 again. Doom Caliber Knight was given to the top 3 players at 2008's SJCs. This is a level 4 Dark Fiend monster with 1900 attack and 1800 defense. It cannot be special summoned, and if a monster effect is activated, it tributes itself to negate and destroy that monster. Doom Caliber Knight has to be one of the earliest instances of a monster negate actually seen play in Yu-Gi-Oh! Its effect makes it quite similar to Lightning Darkness Dragon in that it must negate any monster effect it sees, but unlike
it's not optional.
Dragon, this one also destroys the monster that activated its effect as well. Though you do need to be careful because it will trigger on your own monsters too. When it was first given out, this card actually saw some experimentation in those same dad decks that had Crush Card Virus and Gold Sarcophagus due to being a decent dark monster, as if having 2 prize cards in the same deck wasn't enough. At least it was a tech and not a must play though. Even before its general release, this card would be generally outclassed as a beater with an upside by Thunder King Ryo, which was generally more useful and splashable. In any case, this card would see a fair bit of experimentation once most of the player base could actually use it, towards the end of 2009. It was played in the side deck to be brought onto matchups where you'd know they'd have to trade badly into it, like Gladiator Beasts and Lightsworns. It was risky to main it as other matchup cards like Treeborn Frog and Vayu could remove it for free. This card saw some play through the years from that point on, being seen mostly as an anti-meta card to hopefully slow your opponent down a bit. There'd be many meta staples where it would do well against from that point onwards, such as Rescue Rabbit and Tour Guide from the Underworld. It being a decent dark became relevant again with Konami unbanning Blackluster Soldier and Void of the Beginning. This card would last see play in 2015 as a decent normal summoned monster in pure Psy-frames. That deck always wanted an empty field to make sure the Psy-frames were alive, so it was nice that Doom Caliber Knight would eventually clear itself from the field. This monster has been severely power crept nowadays, as you can get a much better payoff for a normal summon in any other competent strategy. But it's one of those cards that would have surely seen a lot more play if it had been widely available at first. Finally, we have the last card to be given out at SJCs, Dark End Dragon. This is a level 8 Dark Dragon Synchro, which takes any tuner plus 1 or more Dark monsters. It has 2600 attack and 2100 defense, and can, once per turn, target a monster your opponent controls and lose 500 attack and defense to send that card to the graveyard. This fittingly named card would represent the end of the Shonen Jump Championship Series, which would then be replaced by the Yu-Gi-Oh! Championship Series, or YCS. The main goal of this change was to make Yu-Gi-Oh! Tourneys into a global phenomenon. The game grew exponentially with time, and Konami now wanted a standard tourney format, which would take place not only in North America, but in Latin America and Europe as well. The last SJC to take place was in Edison, New Jersey, and that tournament's format is now the most played retro format in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the moment. Edison format, as it's called, has dethroned even GOAT format in popularity recently. Going back to the actual card, Dark End Dragon is a boss monster which can perform a very unique role for its time. Though this Synchro 8 pull included powerhouses like Stardust Dragon and Thought Ruler Arcfiend, none had actual removal effects like Dark End Dragon does. This card can be used to deal with powerful flip monsters like Raikou without triggering their effects. It could be used to stop chains of recruiters such as Mrs. Tomato, and even break the then dreaded Duplock. The only reason why this card wasn't played in every deck was due to the restriction in its materials on, and of course its availability. Nowadays, when people go back and play Edison format, Black Wings are often considered the best deck of the time, with zombie-focused strategies not far behind it. This card being available to everyone is certainly one of the reasons why these decks are considered to be much stronger now than they were historically. After this card stopped being exclusively a prize card in late 2010, it was still a decent option for removal in dark decks. However, now it had to compete with Scrap Dragon, which could pop any card rather than just monsters, and it had completely generic materials, making it into the better choice most of the time. Dark End Dragon marked the end of its era, and its prize card version remains as one of the most iconic and sought-after gems for collectors to this day. Flip monsters have been an important part of Yu-Gi-Oh's identity, going as far back as the game's first set, The Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon. In older formats, their effects were so powerful that they were placed in a lot of different strategies, to the point where a ton of flip monsters were considered staples. However, in the modern era, it's fairly rare to see a deck play flip monsters anymore, which is why today we're going to discuss the glory days of flip monsters, their fall from grace, and how their role has changed in the modern game. So, what actually is a flip monster? A flip monster is a specific subtype of monster that has an effect that's highlighted by the keyword flip. The word flip usually means that a particular effect will trigger whenever the card is flipped face up by any means, whether that's being flip summoned, flipped up by battle, or being flipped up by a card effect. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. There's a few flip monsters that don't have trigger effects when they're flipped face up, and instead will only apply a continuous effect like Aroma Jar or Death Ex Crawler. But these monsters are still treated as flip monsters regardless. Likewise, there are also a ton of monsters that do have trigger effects when they're flip face up, like Girgi Armor and Snowman Eater. These cards might be mechanically some flip monsters, but they aren't actually treated as flip monsters themselves. As a result, there's no hard and fast rule for what a flip monster can actually be, with the only real consistent theming being that you'll usually need to flip a monster face up to get access to its effects. In the modern era, however, this is usually a huge downside. The general idea of flip monsters is rooted in how classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Used to play out. Instead of summoning out a strong beat stick, you could instead use your single normal summon turn to set a monster with a powerful flip effect that could turn the tides of the duel on a later turn. Because in older Yu-Gi-Oh! These flip effects were generically powerful, and would act as some of the game's strongest removal and follow-up options available to you at the time. So if your opponent didn't remove them from the field by a card effect, they'd be punished by a potentially game-winning effect when it got to your turn, or when they ran over your set monster by battle. This strength was compounded by the fact that in older formats, removal options were a lot more limited than they are today. And in a lot of cases, your opponent would have no choice but to trigger your flip effects if they wanted to remove your monsters from the field. Counterplay still existed for flip monsters, but in older formats, if you set a monster, there was a strong chance of you being able to use your flip effects to win free advantage and tempo. However, while all of this was true in classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, flip monsters are usually terrible in a more modern context. And the main reason
Yeah,
why
they got
is
nerfed.
unfortunately because of how flip monsters usually function. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, most of the game's strongest playmakers usually have effects that provide you with an immediate advantage in some way. Whether that's with Axis Code's pop effect to wipe your opponent's field, or Alubra's effect to add branded fusion from your deck to your hand, a lot of modern cards are designed for a faster game, so are just as fast and usually provide you with an effect that you can use instantly. And that's where the problem with flip monsters begins, because on their own, flip monsters don't provide you with any kind of usable advantage on your first turn. So you have to rely on other cards that let you flip your monsters face up as soon as possible, or just hope your opponent doesn't have any removal or negate options to deal with your set monsters before the battle phase. But this game plan is wholly unreliable because removal options have become a lot more common and easier to access, especially because of the number of powerful tools that exist in most players' extra decks. As a result, most decks that could play flip monsters usually default to playing cards which are immediately playable instead, in order to keep up with the current speed of the game. This meant that a lot of classic flip monsters that were almost overpowered in old Yu-Gi-Oh! Now very rarely see play in current competitive decks because of how slow and clunky they are when compared to more modern effect monsters.
That's
But
just
the
sad.
mechanic as a whole isn't entirely dead, and there have been a number of attempts to reinvent and redefine what it means to be a flip monster. A lot of these attempts have resulted in more failures, but some have resulted in some of the strongest flip monsters in the game's history. Let's start off by looking over 3 classic flip monsters that saw a ton of competitive play in older formats that had fallen off in terms of playability: Magician of Faith, Raikou, Lightsworn Hunter, and Gravekeeper's Spy. Magician of Faith is a light spellcaster monster with pretty meager stats, but if it's flip face up, you get to target any spell card in your graveyard and add it to your hand. The effect
Which is really
simple
good.
and is representative of the design of a ton of other flip monsters that saw play in older formats, like Dekoichi and Magical Merchant. The idea behind these cards was that they all provided you with a +1 in terms of card advantage, effectively replacing themselves with another card whenever they're flip face up. What drove Magician of Faith over the top and made it so ban-worthy was the power level of the spell cards that were available in older Yu-Gi-Oh! You see,
Monster
while classic
Reborn,
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Dark
is
Hole,
definitely a
Raigeki.
lot slower than the modern game, spell cards were even more insane back then than they are today, with the trinity of Graceful Charity, Delinquent Duo, and Pot of Greed all being legal.
Oh, Pot of
And because
Greed,
these
yeah.
cards were so generically powerful, just about every deck would play them. Magician of Faith made it so that you could recycle and reuse some of the strongest spell cards in the game, and provided you with devastatingly strong follow-up allowing you to reuse already game-winning unfair cards like Graceful Charity several times in a duel, which is why it was featured in so many different strategies, because if you were going to play these absurdly strong spell cards anyway, it just made sense to play a card that lets you use them again multiple times. On the opposite end of the spectrum were flip monsters that act as removal options for your opponent's cards, like Night Assailant and Armed Ninja. But by far, the strongest of these kinds of flip monsters was Raikou, Lightsworn Hunter, because whenever Raikou was flip face up, you had to send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, and you got a chance to destroy any card in the field. Both of these effects were benefits of the cards. Raikou's Meal made it so you could end up triggering a beneficial graveyard effect like a Shadow or Dandelion, but most of Raikou's strength came from it being able to pop any card in the field. In older formats, removal options as a whole were generally less common, so monsters that can act as removal were already fairly strong. And most removal options were usually specific to a particular type of card. Raigeki is only going to be able to pop monsters, and Heavy Storm is only ever going to be able to deal with back row. But cards that could do both were somewhat uncommon and incredibly valuable, because it meant that with Raikou, every deck had a stable option that was capable of either taking down an opponent's boss monster that they overextended into, or it could be used to deal with an opponent's oppressive floodgate, which gave Raikou a ton of versatility as a pop. And last but not least is Gravekeeper's Spy, a flip monster that can act as a swarming tool, because whenever Gravekeeper's Spy is flip face up, you can special summon out another Gravekeeper monster from your deck with 1500 or less attack. And this
That's
includes
pretty
another
good.
copy of itself, since Spy only has 1200 attack. So while Gravekeeper Spy was strong in Gravekeepers as an archetypal tool, the main reason it saw competitive play was that a ton of different strategies would use it as a way to swarm and bring free bodies to the field as quickly as possible. This made Spy a really strong staple that had a ton of versatility, since it could be used as a defensive wall, an offensive threat, or even as material for an even stronger monster. And how Spy was used would change in every different Yu-Gi-Oh! Generation. In early Yu-Gi-Oh!, Spy was a solid advantage generator that also guaranteed you free tribute fodder for a Monarch monster. During Teledad format, Spy also gave you a free body that you could use as synchro material, and a Dark attribute also made it so it was a lot easier to turbo out Dark Arm Dragon. And in early Zexlo formats, Spy was even a solid rank 4 generator. Essentially, swarming as a concept has always been a valuable thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! And Spy was one of the only reliable means of actually flooding the fields in older formats, before we had access to more archetypal tools. In the modern era, the concepts that Magician of Faith, Raikou, and Spy represent are still really important ideas, potentially even more so than back then. But despite how good these cards are conceptually, they never see any play in the current competitive format. This is because every one of these 3 monsters has the inherent downside of being a flip monster, which makes
And
them
again, just
slow
taking
and
too
clunky
long
for
to
how fast
activate.
the game has gotten. And with the constant evolution of the game's card pool throughout the years, there are now just better cards which do what these 3 cards tried to do, but better. There's no point in waiting a turn for Gravekeeper Spy when Buzzsaw Shark can give you an instant rank 4 instead. And why would you wait to flip your Raikou face up with Book of Taiyu for 1 pop when you have Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched to wipe your opponent's entire field? And why would you need Magician of Faith for follow-up when most archetypes already have strong archetypal tools that allow them to access their best spell cards anyway? These options are just stronger, better, and faster than most utility-based flip monsters in the game. And because of how vulnerable and slow flip monsters are, there's just never any reason to go out of your way to use them. In fact, there are even more modern variations of Magician of Faith, Gravekeeper Spy, and Raikou that all don't see any competitive play, because being a flip monster is just inherently a downside to the card, especially when compared to regular on-summon trigger effects. But even though flip monsters don't see any more generic play, they haven't been power crept out of the game entirely. It's just that their role in the game has changed. Instead of being the powerful staples they once were, the flip monsters that usually see the most amount of competitive play are ones that are centered to a particular archetype, with the most iconic being Shadows. The Shadow monsters are an archetype of flip monsters that use their incredibly strong spell and trap card lineup to access their powerful fusion boss monsters. But unlike most other flip monsters, the Shadow monsters have effects whenever they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect in a similar way to a card like Night Assailant. This actually solves one of the key issues that flip monsters have. Most of the time, your opponent can just remove them from the field before you have an opportunity to flip them face up, leaving you with nothing. However, the Shadow monsters don't have this weakness, because whenever your opponent tries to pop your set Shadow monster, you get the chance to punish them by triggering your Shadow monster's graveyard effects. So if your opponent tried to remove your face down Shadow Beast to stop you from drawing, you still get to draw a card when it's sent. Or if your opponent tried to stop you from using the bounce effect of Shadow Dragon, you still get to pop a spell or trap card they control. But that was just the worst case scenario, because with their strong trap-based support cards, you could easily flip up your Shadow monsters on your opponent's turn to get access to their powerful flip effects, like Hedgehog's Search or Squamata's Pop. These factors combined made it so that Shadows, a deck comprised almost entirely of flip monsters, was capable of dominating early Pendulum formats.
Crazy.
And to contend against the likes of Cleafort and Burning Abyss. And even to this day, the strategy still remains evergreen as more modern strategies like Invoked and Tearlaments will often choose to incorporate Shadow cards into their arsenal. However, while Shadows made these flip effects playable, they were never the main reason to actually play the strategy. Because even back in 2014, the best cards in the deck were never the flip effects themselves. Most of the deck's power was concentrated in their fusion spells and fusion monsters. El Shadow Construct and Shadow Fusion were such big threats that in 2014, it was actually a detriment to have a monster summoned from the extra deck as part of your end board, as it meant that if your opponent had a Shadow Fusion, they got to summon a free construct and send any Shadow monster from the deck to the graveyard, allowing them to trigger whatever Shadow graveyard effect they wanted and drown at advantage. Similarly, in 2023, the Shadow monsters don't see play because they're flip monsters, they see play because they're a necessary requirement for summoning out El Shadow Window. And as a result, the Shadow flip monsters that see the most amount of competitive success aren't those with the best flip effects. It's those with the most beneficial graveyard effects that give you some advantage if you happen to mill them or use them as material. Which makes it so that, for most strategies, the Shadow flip monsters are bricks. So in reality, while Shadow monsters had their time in the competitive metagame, they're more of an example of the success of fusion summoning and floating effects, rather than being an example of successful flip effects. Still, they're a notable part of the game's history, and whatever you attribute the deck's success to, the deck is still mainly composed of flip monsters that manage to see a lot of competitive play. However, there are still some strategies out there that have managed to see modern competitive success, while specifically relying on their flip effects. Guru Control is one such deck that's reliant on a specific flip monster, Subterra Guru. Guru has 2 hard ones per turn effects. Its flip effect lets you add any Subterra card except Guru from your deck to your hand. And while it's face up, you can target another monster in the field and flip both Guru and that target monster to face down defense position, with this being a quick effect if you control any other Subterra card. With Guru, you have a lot of interesting search targets, with your 2 strongest options being Subterra Final Battle, an archetypal trap card with a variety of beneficial effects, or Subterra Fiendness, an Omni-Negate while you control face-up Subterra monster. This forms a really compact but powerful engine that, when used with other strong control tools such as Floodgates, manages to form a really competent and meta-viable strategy that relies on a flip monster as a win condition. And the best part is, unlike most other flip monsters, you have an opportunity to use Guru's flip effect on your very first turn. You see, when you activate Hidden City, the archetypal field spell for Subterra, you can add any Subterra monster from your deck to your hand. If you choose to add a Guru, you can then set that Guru to your field and then use the on-field effect of Hidden City to flip it face up, so you can trigger its search effect. And even in hands where you don't draw Hidden City, you can rely on your Floodgates to slow the game down enough to the point where Guru's effect is virtually guaranteed to be useful. Now, if Hidden City didn't exist at all, Guru would be a lot less strong of a card, since, like most flip monsters, it's not immediately useful by itself, and would likely have seen way less competitive play. But because of the archetypal tools that exist around it, it's been elevated to meta viability that makes it a fairly unique game plan. Guru being a flip monster is actually even advantageous for the strategy, as it makes it so you can easily play under your own floodgates, and you can even use the effect of Red Eye's Fusion while still going through your full combo, since you never normal summon with the deck and only set. As a result, Guru is always on the fringe of meta contention. Never quite being one of the best strategies you can play, but it's always a solid anti-meta strategy. And a huge part of that is because of how its archetypal tools make it immediately usable, and provide it with solid payoffs that can actually be used to win games, rather than just generic card advantage. In terms of meta viable flip monsters though, there really aren't that many, with the Shadows and Guru being the only real exceptions for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters are just inherently worse if you have to flip them face up, rather than being normal or special summoned, no matter how strong their effects may be. Because in order to get access to these effects, you have to go through extra hurdles to actually flip them face up, which usually requires other cards or resources. Some flip monsters
So it's not
even
worth
have
it anymore.
insanely powerful effects that are capable of shutting down your opponent completely, like Death Ex Crawler, a one-sided skill drain, and Guard Dog, which locks your opponent out of special summoning entirely. But there's no reason to ever use these cards when you can instead rely on easier to use floodgates to do similar things. However, there are ways of making flip monsters more viable, as flip-based mechanics and monsters do occasionally have their place in the meta, and a lot of that has to do with the card quality that exists around these monsters. Even right now, one of the strongest rogue decks of the current format is Ninja, a deck that doesn't play any flip monsters, but relies on setting and flipping up their own monsters to generate advantage and disrupt your opponent. And a lot of that strength has to do with the strength of the archetypal cards that exist around the ninja monsters, which allow them to easily swarm the field and flip themselves face up to activate their effects more often. Unfortunately, however, even though ninja monsters use flipping to win games, most of the ninjas aren't actually flip monsters. And this is a huge benefit for the deck, as it means their effects don't just
I'm
trigger
trying to
when they flip
think.
face
Armed
up,
and
they can
Crimson are
also
the only
trigger
two
unloadable
flip
special
effect
summon. This
ninjas
allows
I
the
can
deck
think
to
of.
reach a much faster pace that can compete with the likes of Kashtira and Branded, that it wouldn't otherwise have if it was a deck based entirely around flip monsters that could only use these effects when flip face up. Good flip monsters do still exist though, and despite how fast the game has gotten, there are still 3 flip monsters on the Forbidden and Limited list. And these are Morphine Jar, Cyber Jar, and Fiber Jar. However,
Of course,
Fiber Jar
it's
is only
the 3
banned because it
jars.
creates long and tedious game states that can hold up an event, making it similar to Self-Destruct Button rather than an actual ban-worthy threat. Morphine and Cyber Jar were extremely strong staples back when they were first released.
God, I love
since they could
Morphing
both be
Jar.
used to instantly refill your hand or field whenever they flip face up, making them really great follow-up and swarming tools. So strong, in fact, they even became the centerpiece of their own FTK-centric strategy, Empty Jar, a deck based around milling out your opponent as quickly as possible by abusing non-once
Honestly, those are the kind of decks I would play.
You could even play this strategy to this day thanks to cards like Gallant Granite and A&D Changer, although, like most flip-based strategies, it's no longer an actual meta threat. As a whole though, it's really unfortunate how far flip monsters have managed to fall from grace. They were once powerhouses of early Yu-Gi-Oh! That were integral to the game's early identity, and provided a ton of different strategies with advantage, swarming, and removal tools that you wouldn't otherwise have. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Has moved on a lot since its early days, and has morphed into a much faster game with an environment that's almost inhospitable to most flip monsters. In almost every situation, you'd want a card that you could immediately use to combo or try to control the game, rather than a flip monster that you either need to wait to use or that you need other cards to use on your first turn. So because of the lack of support and their clunky nature, it's pretty fair to call flip monsters failed cards. It's usually only a detriment to be a flip monster in the modern era that need to be flip face up, unlike something like a ninja monster where there's a lot more flexibility in how their effects are triggered. There are examples of successful flip-based strategies that appear in the metagame that you can call successful. Shadow is still a competent threat, and Guru has even taught recent YCSs. So if you define a successful mechanic as one that has seen competitive play, then no, flip monsters aren't a failed mechanic. But if you think about how difficult the mechanic is to use, its lack of support, and how few flip monsters even actually see competitive play, it's definitely more of a failed mechanic than a successful one. So, how could they be improved? The mechanic isn't completely dead though, and there are a number of ways that flip monsters could be improved to see more widespread play. There are a number of different solutions that you can take from other flip decks that have seen success. Future flip monsters could benefit from having alternative effects like the shadow monsters, or could instead have more archetypal cards designed around allowing them to be used instantly, like how Hidden City makes Guru playable. The mechanic could even be revamped entirely, and made to play in a similar way to modern ninjas by allowing their effects to also be used on the normal or special summon. However, what the mechanic needs more than anything else is more generic support. Some of the weakest subtypes in the game, such as normal monsters, have been made competitively viable thanks to support that exists around them. If flip monsters received similar such support, then there's a solid chance that even in the state they're in right now, flip monsters could become a viable threat. but as it stands right now, it's unlikely they'll
Yeah,
ever reach the
I don't
same
think we're going to
status
be
that they
seeing
once
flip
had.
monsters
In
ever
the early
again.
days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, spell cards provided some of the most powerful effects in the game. They shaped entire decks and have strategies built around them. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the best continuous spells from the classic era, which we describe as just the time period before synchro monsters came out. Would you like Kashtira's zone blocking effects in the classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Without bringing Kashtira? Well, look no further than our number 10 spot with the best classic continuous spells, Ground Collapse.
Ooh,
This continuous
yes.
spell card has the effect that once activated, you select 2 main monster zones on the field, and those 2 selected main monster zones cannot be occupied by a monster. Few cards in general
So you
tend
could
to lock
basically
zones,
drop your opponent's monster
especially
card
in
zone to
classic Yu-Gi-Oh!
3.
And depriving your opponent of an important resource like a monster card zone can find some usage. However, in reality, within classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's pretty rare that your opponent will need all their monster zones. Classic is just a lot slower than modern. Aggro decks typically focus on archetypal beatdowns, or aggro decks like Beast or Chaos. Most extenders are searchers rather than special summons, and battle traps are back and see constant play. So suffice to say, Ground Collapse isn't the best card on this list. But the competition with
Still
other
useful.
continuous spells in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Aren't really that much better. However, in tandem with some other cards, Ground Collapse can work. It's been a good tool for control lockdown strategies like Spatial Collapse Lockdown,
Like,
which
think of
is a
2 ground
significant
collapses.
improvement and expands on Ground Collapse's effect. This continuous trap card can only be activated if both you and your opponent have 5 or less cards on the field. And what it does is prevent both players from exceeding having 5 cards on their side of the field. So, with the duo
Ooh.
of Ground Collapse and Spatial Collapse with Ojama Trio's effect to summon tokens to your opponent's side of the field, you can lock out all of your opponent's monster zones, preventing them from essentially playing the game and only having 2 spell trap card zones.
Oh,
And
that's
eventually,
mean.
you can deck out your opponent by just waiting around long enough with a single copy of Outstanding Dogmaron in your deck, so you don't deck out first. And at number 9, we have a complement to Floodgates, Mass Driver. This continuous spell card is infamously known for enabling some insane OTKs and FTKs strategies through its effect, which allow you to attribute 1 monster on your side of the field to deal 400 damage to your opponent's life points. Without a once per turn limit on the damage or amount of attributes, Mass Driver is one of the most abusable cards, with it being a key component in tons of burn FTK strategies.
Especially
Thankfully,
if
in the
you're able to
TCG where Mass
continuously get
Driver is
monsters
truly
on your side.
usable, it's banned. The most well-known use of its abuse was with the infamous Frog Burn OTK. But we're talking about classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Here, where the card isn't banned, and it's significantly harder to make use of its not once per turn effect. But don't let that fool you, as there is actually a Mass Driver OTK in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! As well. There is a specific Mass Driver FTK deck that uses a combination of Mass Driver, Dark Magician of Chaos's effect to add back spells from graveyard to hand on summon, as well as it banishing when it leaves the field, Dimension Fusion, which is a monster reborn but for banished monsters, and Spell Economics, which lets you not pay life points for spell cards. So essentially what would happen is that Spell Economics would make Dimension Fusion's 2,000 life point cost to bring back banished monsters free. So by bringing back Dark Magician of Chaos, you can get your Dimension Fusion back for free, and then tribute Dark Magician with Mass Driver's effect, and just continue until you FTK your opponent. There's even a
Ooh.
trap card counterpart called Type 0 Magic Crusher, which has the same effect but for spell cards and sending from your hand instead from the field, which is significantly harder to capitalize on despite having the same effect. Fortunately, in classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, infinite loops are quite the rare sight due to the limited card pool, and in almost all cases, it's not worth tributing your monster to deal a low 400 damage to your opponent unless you can infinitely loop the effect. So it's hard to fully capitalize on the strength of Mass Driver, which is why it's only at number 9. Moving on to number 8, we have the continuous spell Chain Energy. This spell card is an intense floodgate of sorts, as it adds attacks to each player for 500 life points whenever they normal summon, special summon, set, or activate cards from their hand. Chain Energy
So
isn't
it hurts
the
to
typical
summon.
negating floodgate. Rather, it's one that adds a cost onto anything your opponent can do, which in some cases is even better. At first glance, 500 damage doesn't seem like a lot, but remember,
But it
this
builds up.
applies to any summon or activation of a card in the hand, which can build up insanely quickly. Chain Energy outputs a lot of early damage onto your opponent when they're starting to establish a board in the slower classic Yu-Gi-Oh! In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, players could easily wipe out their own life points by just going full combo. But then again, the modern format has a ton of tools to deal with random spell and trap cards. However, the same can't be said about the classic era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as spell and trap card removal wasn't as common. There's a few options that have little or no cost, like Mystical Space Typhoon and Heavy Storm, but they're both limited to 1 copy, with Harpy's Feather Duster even being banned. Regardless, Chain Energy is a double-edged sword. The Chain Energy tax applies to both players, so players
Which
who run
is
Chain
fair.
Energy can have their strategy backfire. Chain Energy serves as a card to limit your opponent's plays as much as possible, which is why it's popular in the heavy slump deck, which fills your opponent's hand with enough cards to activate the Heavy Slump Trap card, which if they have 8 or more cards in the hand, they shuffle their hand to the deck and draw 2 cards. From there, your opponent has significantly less options to play, and even if they do play, they'll be taking burn damage from Chain Energy. Chain Energy serves quite the complementary role in burn decks alongside the likes of Wave Motion Cannon, Just Desserts, and Ceasefire for additional burn damage. And at number 7, we have Card of Safe Return. This card has the effect that when a monster is special summoned from the grave, you can draw 1 card. Despite its simple effect, Card of Safe Return is banned in modern TCG format for its effect. Although it's significantly more frequent to special summon from the graveyard in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's only like a staple or 2 that special summons from the graveyard in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! So with a Card of Safe Return, it's a free advantage. And some decks
Just being able to
really
draw
capitalize
cards
on
every
the
time you special
advantage that
summon,
Card of Safe Return
it's
can
nice.
provide. A lot of people remember Card of Safe Return being used in the anime when the effect backfired against Strings in his duel against Yugi, as Strings had to draw through his entire deck due to an infinite loop of revival jams effect in tandem with Slifer the Sky Dragon's effect. For example, Card of Safe Return is used in conjunction with Ectoplasmer and Malice Doll of Demise. Ectoplasmer is another continuous spell that has the effect that once at the end phase of the player's turn, the player must tribute 1 face-up monster and inflict damage to their opponent equal to half the original attack of the monster, combined with Malice Doll of Demise, which has the effect that during the next standby phase after this card was sent from the field to the graveyard by the effect of specifically a continuous spell card, you can special summon the doll from the graveyard. So with Card of Safe Return's effect, you can easily draw an extra card each turn. Despite the most common
Which is insane.
Reborn spell, Monster Reborn, being banned in this format, there are still a ton of other cards that decks can utilize to take advantage of Card of Safe Return. However, classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have that many tools for common use of Card of Safe Return, which is why it isn't so high on this list. And at number 6, we have the continuous spell Stumbling. This floodgate has the effect that when any monster is normal summoned, flip summoned, or special summoned, they're changed to defense position. Similar to the previous entry in this list, Chain Energy, Stumbling is not a negating floodgate, but still packs a strong effect. Stumbling essentially provides a free safe turn so that your opponent can't push directly for advantage. However, that applies to both players. It's similar to Magic the Gathering Summoning Sickness, where when a creature enters the field, they can't attack nor activate their effects. However, with stumbling effects, monster effects can
Switches
still be
them to defense,
Regardless, stumbling has proved to be
which
a
is
great
good.
tool for control lockdown decks, which aim to control your opponent's actions as much as possible. It's most popular in the Clown Control deck, which utilizes cards like Stumbling and Labyrinth of Nightmare, in conjunction with Dream Clown and Blade Rabbit to destroy monsters. Following suit is the Ticking Time Bomb Wave Motion Cannon. This continuous spell card has the effect that during your main phase, you can send Wave Motion Cannon to the graveyard to inflict 1,000 damage to your opponent for each of your standby phases that has passed since the card was activated. So essentially, if you stall out for 8 of your turns, you can win the duel in most cases. But coupled with any attacks you do to your opponent, you don't need to wait the full 8 turns. Wave Motion Cannon sees a fair amount of use in the slower classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Format, as it serves as a great tool in control decks to deal out large bursts of damage, as most control decks tend to limit and slow down the game even more. Achieving 8 turns or less, depending on what kind of deck you're using, becomes easier and easier. Not to mention the limited number of back row removal options that exist in the format. From Jam Revival Control to Last Warrior Control, Wave Motion Cannon is a stable deck. Few decks, if any, run a singular copy of the card. It's almost always at 3 copies. Especially since there is no limit to the effect activation, meaning you can have 3 Wave Motion Cannons fire at the same time if you manage to draw them. And at number 4, we have the old school discount Mystic Mine, the continuous spell card Kaiser Coliseum. This spell card has the effect that if there's 1 or more monsters on the field of the controller of this card, their opponent cannot place monsters on their side of the field if the number of monsters would exceed the number of monsters of the controller of this card. So in other words, your opponent cannot exceed the amount of monsters that you control. If you control 1 monster, then your opponent can't have more than 1 monster on the field. Kaiser Coliseum is an oppressive floodgate that few decks can truly make good use of due to its effect. As to fully capitalize on it, you need to be able to lock down the game with only 1 monster and keep said monster in a protected position. Despite how hard that sounds, it's actually a lot easier said than done. There are several control decks that capitalize on the Coliseum's oppressive nature as a great tool to control your opponents, as locking them down into 1 or 2 monster zones can easily shut down a multitude
Very
of decks.
detrimental.
Decks typically have 1 survivable boss monster to beat down your opponent while under the effect of Coliseum. A fun usage of Kaiser Coliseum is with another card on our list, Ground Collapse. In a deck that features both these cards, the deck aims to lock your opponent out of using monster zones with cards like Ground Collapse, Kaiser Coliseum, Spatial Collapse, and Ojama Trio. However, like all the aforementioned floodgates and even
That's a
more
weird
so
way
with
to
Kaiser
pronounce
Coliseum,
trio.
the card loses a lot of its value the more populated your board is. And at number 3 is our last flaggy in this list, Level Limit Area B. This spell card has a deceptively simple effect to change all level 4 or higher monsters to defense position. Level Limit Area B is arguably the most popular continuous spell card the classic Yu-Gi-Oh has, as it enables a ton of different strategies. In a format where boss monsters are typically high-level effect monsters, Level Limit Area B essentially stops them in their tracks. This paves the way for low-level monster strategies to thrive, and there are a ton. Like most floodgates, this card thrives in control strategies, specifically and obviously with low-level monsters. From Raging Flame Sprite equipped with the several equipped cards to stall out the game with Final Countdown to the infamous Pac-Man decks, Level Limit Area B is a
Pac-Man
staple for
decks?
lockdown decks in general.
Never heard
The
about
most
that.
iconic deck, the Pac-Man deck, which stands for Pure Advantage Camels Munch All Noobs, and essentially the deck
Okay, that
relies
makes
on
sense.
desert-themed flip monsters like Des Lacunda, Medusa Worm, Swarm of Locusts, and Swarm of Scarabs to essentially starve your opponent out of their resources, as each of the main monsters can flip themselves back down. Coupled with the protection of Level Limit Area B and its trap counterpart Gravity Bind, opponents would feel the heat of the desert and lose. If Level Limit Area B exists, doesn't that mean there should be a Level Limit Area A as well?
Yes.
Well, it does, but it's significantly less notable as its counterpart. Level Limit Area A is a continuous trap card that features almost the same artwork and has the effect to change all face-up level 3 or lower monsters to face-up attack position. So, suffice to say, not the most playable card, as few strategies, if any, would rely on Level Limit Area A. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, Crossout Designator is one of the more popular anti-hand trap cards for its effect to remove a specific card from the deck to negate cards of the same name. In classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, there's a similar card with a more permanent solution, and I'm not talking about taking your opponent's deck and removing the card yourself. I'm talking about our number 2 spot, Prohibition. This spell card, once activated, you declare a card name. The card's effects can't be used. However, that doesn't apply to cards that are on the field, including if they are face down. But regardless, it serves as more of a permanent, continuous version of Prohibition. The strength of Prohibition comes in its versatility. Like any format, there are staples that every deck uses. To completely shut down these staples that every deck uses is invaluable. Even outside of staples, in a multiple game setting and you know your opponent's key combo pieces or the boss monster, you can just shut them down then and there as long as you keep Prohibition on the field. The only downside is that you need to keep Prohibition on the field to maintain the ban. And unlike this seemingly stronger and modern version of the card Crossout Designator, you don't need to have a copy of the card to remove your deck. You can specifically target cards your opponent uses. For example, if your opponent uses a Chaos Sorcerer deck, you can declare that card as a targeted card for Prohibition, and that shuts down their main boss monster, and unless they have spell and trap card removal outside the one copy Mystical Space Typhoon, then they're in trouble. Regardless, Prohibition in the slower pace of classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Is insanely strong for its ability to preemptively disrupt your opponent's key cards, especially in games 2 and 3. Pond of Greed is infamously known for being one of the best cards ever printed for the free advantage it provides you. Mirage of Nightmare is another card that is on a similar level of strength. See, Mirage of Nightmare is a continuous spell card that has the effect that once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you draw until you have 4 cards in your hand. Then if you do, during your next standby phase, randomly discard the same number of cards you drew. So if you get rid of your hand during your turn, you can draw 4 more cards, but at the cost of discarding 4 cards later on. Drawing cards and accessing more of your deck is always beneficial, as you can get more key cards or just resources in general. Even in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! There are plenty of decks that gain advantage or have specific effect triggers when certain cards are in the graveyard, and Mirage of Nightmare enables those kinds of decks to an extent. Another common usage of Mirage of Nightmare is with cards that either get rid of Mirage of Nightmare, as in spell trap card removal, or emergency provisions. These examples are the most common combo culprits with Mirage. See, lots of players would destroy Mirage of Nightmare before the cost of discarding cards to take place, giving them a draw 4 for free as there's no lingering effect.
Which is more powerful than Pot of Greed.
Not to mention its synergy with the ever popular Emergency Provisions Quick Play spell card, which allows you to send any number of your other spell trap cards you control to the graveyard to gain 1,000 life points for each card sent to the graveyard in this way. So on top of drawing up to 4, you would get rid of Mirage of Nightmare to gain life points on top of it. Thankfully,
and it's why this card is banned
and won't see the light of day for a long time. Equip cards are the least used types of spell cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Already under equip cards
effects compared to the strength of modern cards. However, in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Where the game is a lot slower, equip cards see some usage. And for this video, classic Yu-Gi-Oh!
Still some good
is just
equip
the time
cards.
period before Synchro Monsters came out. Starting off our list at number 10 is Big Bang Shot. This equip spell came out back in 2003 and was commonly
that's
in
the piercing damage card.
2000s. This was because Big Bang Shot is a very splashable equip card. Simply, the equip spell gives the equipped monster a 400 attack boost as well as piercing damage, meaning that if you attack a defense position monster, you deal damage to your opponent equal to the difference between your monster's attack and their defense points. However, the only downside other than being an equip spell is that when Big Bang Shot leaves the field, you banish the equipped monster. Big Bang Shot, despite its seemingly mediocre effect, has some great use in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! With high beat stick monsters and the battle phase being significantly more important in the current format, Big Bang Shot serves as a simple but effective wall-breaking tool. A good tool if your opponent stays on a defensive wall like Spirit Reaper. Throw in a Big Bang Shot into your boss monster and beat through your opponent's defense position monsters, or just deal damage to the battle immune monsters. A common strategy with Big Bang Shot is using it in tandem with Asura Priest, in an OTK strategy that revolves around abusing its multiple attack effect. See, Asura Priest has the effect where it can attack all monsters your opponent controls once each. Combo this with some Ojama tokens that are summoned to your opponent's side of the field through Ojama Trio, and the high attack point cards like Mage Power and Big Bang Shot, and you've got yourself an OTK. However, Big Bang Shot isn't widely used for two main reasons in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! The main reason is that if Big Bang Shot leaves the field, the equipped monster gets banished instead. And unlike modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, there aren't as many tools to bring back banished monsters. So if you have your big monster equipped with Big Bang Shot and your opponent simply throws out a spell trap removal, then say goodbye to your boss monster. However, this can be used offensively as well. You can equip Big Bang Shot to your opponent's monster and then use any spell or trap removal to banish that monster. The other reason why it's not used much is that piercing damage isn't game-changing. Although, as nice as the 400 bonus attack points and piercing damage are for the additional damage that it provides, it's far outclassed by the other equipped spells on this list. However, despite the downsides, Big Bang Shot fulfills a niche that few cards of the classic era do.
It's still
that's
nice.
Why it's at number 10. And at number 9 on this list, we have Horn of the Unicorn. This equip spell provides the equipped monster with a sizable 700 bonus to attack and defense points, as well as the effect that if Horn of the Unicorn is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can return it to the top of your deck. Horn of the Unicorn was one of the earliest equip cards, coming out more than 20 years ago in 2002 Spell Ruler release.
Pretty good attack buff.
Appearances in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime early on. Its first debut was in episode 4 in one of the earliest duels of the series. It's even seen in Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds briefly as Luna uses it in her duel. Regardless, Horn of the Unicorn can provide some pretty good bonuses to both attack and defense, which is pretty rare for equip cards in general, as surprisingly, very few of them actually increase the defense of a monster. Not to take away from its main appeal, that being its effect to return to the top of the deck when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, which allows for more or less a constant 700 attack and defense point boost. However, this effect is Horn of the Unicorn's downfall, as it takes your draw up. So, if it keeps getting destroyed, then you're locked into drawing it over and over, which at times can be detrimental, which is why it's only number 9 on our list. But
Yeah,
again,
that's not
the
good.
versatility and renewability for the Unicorn still puts it on the list for classic Yu-Gi-Oh! And at number 8, we have Rod of Silence KS. This equip spell has two effects, just like our last entry. First is the equipped monster gains 500 defense points. The other effect is why this card is used, in that all other spell effects that target the equipped monster are negated and destroyed. So essentially, protection against the second most common card in the game.
So it kind of has a sort of
the main use of KS
X-proof.
is spell negation. Spell cards that target your opponent's monsters are quite common in classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, with cards like Book of Moon or Enemy Controller as common cards in decks across the format. Not to mention, KS negates all cards on this list as well, in that equip cards constantly target the monster. So if your opponent uses a Snatch Steal or an Ekibyo Drakmor to target your monster with KS when it's equipped,
it won't
that's
work.
not going to resolve. Constant spell card negation is quite the rare fact, let alone for the worst type of spell card in the game. Some fun lore with the Rod of Silence in that it's part of a group called the Guardian Weapons. This is a group of 8 monsters that all have a signature weapon, that being the Guardian Weapons, which are Butterfly Dagger Elma with Guardian Elma, Gravity Axe Garl with Guardian Garl, Twin Swords of Flashing Light Trice with Guardian Trice, Wicked Breaking Flameberg Bow with Guardian Glamberg, Shooting Star Bull Seal with Guardian Seal, Rod of Silence KS with Guardian KS, Celestial Star Yatos with Guardian Yatos, and Reaper Scythe Death Scythe with Guardian Dread Scythe. Each of the Guardians
I didn't realize there were 8.
require the equip spell to already be on the field to summon them. However, while they are both on the field, both the equip card and the monster can do some damage. For example, there's the Celestial Sword Yatos and Guardian Yatos. The Celestial Sword has the effect that the equipped monster gains 500 attack, and when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you can target a Guardian Yatos to gain 500 attack for each banished monster. While Guardian Yatos, once on the field, can send an equipped spell card to the graveyard to target 3 monsters in your opponent's graveyard and banish them, and it gains 500 attack per banished monster. So the combination of the two can give Yatos a pretty sizable attack point gain on top of its already 2500 attack. However, the effect typically overlaps with KS's effect, as the Guardian is unaffected by spell card effects and can't be targeted for attacks. Unfortunately, for the equip card, it doesn't protect itself just like the monster. So, like most equipped spells, it's quite vulnerable to spell and trap destruction. Regardless, in the slow-paced play of early Yu-Gi-Oh!, Rod of Silence has some amazing value for negating a wide variety of spell cards.
Yeah.
And at number 7, we have Megamorph. This equip
Ooh,
spell
yes.
is the epitome of a double-edged sword. Megamorph's effect is that while your life points are lower than your opponent's, the equipped monster's attack is double. However, if your life points are higher, then the equipped monster's attack becomes halved. Megamorph theoretically has the highest attack point gain out of all the equipped spells, because if you equip it to a Blue Eyes White Dragon, or any other large beat stick, their attack is doubled. So, sticking with our Blue Eyes example, it gains 3,000 attack points, which can easily swing games while you're behind. But that's the issue. You have to be behind when it comes to Megamorph, as that's only when you get the good effect. Once the Blue Eyes beats over a weaker blocker in the way and your opponent's life points fall below, then your Blue Eyes White Dragon is looking more like a Blackland Fire Dragon. But Megamorph has found some fun strategies to abuse its effect. Specifically with Cyberstein, which is a monster that has the cost to pay 5,000 life points to cheat out a fusion monster from your extra deck. The OTK involved using Cyberstein's effect to bring out Master of Oz, which has a staggering 4,200 attack points. Then, by equipping with Megamorph, you can pretty easily beat through any monster in your way. And at number 6, we have the Axe of Despair. This equipped spell not only adds an extra 1,000 attack points, but also has the effect that when it's sent from the field to the grave, you can tribute a monster to place the axe on top of your deck. So essentially, Axe of Despair is a better, stronger version of the previously mentioned Horn of the Unicorn. Not only does Axe of Despair provide a better attack boost than the Horn, but also gives the player the choice to bring the Axe of Despair back from the grave once it's destroyed. Although the cost is significantly resource heavy compared to Horn of the Unicorn, but
when you have to sacrifice a creature.
Unlike Horn of the Unicorn, the main reason why Axe of Despair is used is just for the 1,000 attack points that it gives while equipped.
It's
Axe
strong.
of Despair is one of the most generic equipped spells that provides one of the highest attack points boosts in the classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, outside of a couple of other options. It's commonly seen in beatdown or OTK decks like Benkei OTK, which is a deck that revolves around equipping armed Samurai Benkei with a bunch of equip cards and attacking multiple times, as the monster effect allows it to attack a number of times equal to the amount of equip cards equipped to it plus 1. Speaking of equipped spell cards that provide bigger boosts than Axe of Despair, next we have United We Stand. This equipped spell has a pretty simple effect, that being the equipped monster gains 800 attack and defense points for each monster you control. Despite how simple United We Stand is, it's a
more monsters, more power.
The card flat out provides an 800 attack boost and quickly ramps up to 1,600, 2,400, 3,200, and 4,000 when you have a monster in each monster zone. However, getting a monster in every monster zone to fully capitalize on the equip card might prove a bit of a challenge in some cases. However, it's not impossible. To prevent the abuse of United We Stand, it was limited to 1 copy for pretty much its entire run in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! There are some strategies that could easily get bodies on board and multiple copies of United We Stand, which could be pretty problematic in that slower format. Regardless, United We Stand provides a ton of battle damage for little to no cost. And most times, the 800 attack boost was all you needed for your equipped spells to beat over big monsters. When United We Stand was released back in 2003, it was only available as an ultra rare, and this followed for the next 3 sets that it was featured in, Labyrinth of Nightmare, Dark Beginnings 1, and Retro Pack 2. So United We Stand was quite the rare find for its time. Next up is the most used equipped spell for attack points, Mage Power. Similar to United We Stand, Mage Power was essentially the same type of card, but rather than gaining bonuses for monsters on the field, Mage Power granted 500 attack and defense for each spell and trap card you controlled instead. This essentially
is still
just
pretty
an
good
upgraded version of United We Stand, as it's far easier to fill your back row with spells and traps compared to monsters. Although the bonus attack points are 300 less each, the ease of using spells and traps compared to monsters is significantly easier to ramp up the attack points. With a card in each spell and trap card zone, including a field spell, a monster can gain up to 3,000 attack from 1 United We Stand. The combination of the ease of use and how common it was to build a strong back row makes Mage Power one of the most commonly used equipped spells that gives attack points in classic Yu-Gi-Oh! It was limited to 1 copy, just like its brother United We Stand, for the same reason. However, the next couple of cards on our list are equally abusable and even outright banned in some cases. And at number 3, we have the King of Infinite Loops, Butterfly Dagger Elma. This equip card provides the equipped monster with 300 attack points, but has the effect that when the card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, Butterfly Dagger Elma returns to the hand. Coincidentally, Butterfly Dagger Elma is also part of the Guardian cards that we mentioned previously on this list with Rod of Silence KS. so it's pretty safe to assume Butterfly Dagger Elma is banned and won't see the light of day ever again, unless Konami changes the effect entirely. Due to Elma's effects not having any limitations, Elma has been used for quite a number of broken infinite loops. The most common example is Royal Magical Library, which has the effect that each time a spell card is activated, you can draw one card. So if Elma was constantly destroyed by a card like Gearfree the Iron Knight, which has the effect that if equipped spell is equipped to it, you destroy the equipped spell, so just that creates a simple infinite loop which allows you to draw through your entire deck or combo off infinitely with cards that do burn damage like Fire Princess and Morale Boost. And at number 2,
would have thought
we
of
have
that.
Premature Burial. This is essentially called the Haunted, but as an equip spell, which is infinitely better. By that I mean its effect allows you to pay 800 life points to target one monster in your graveyard, and then special summon it in attack position. Once Premature Burial is destroyed, then you destroy that special summon monster. Like the previous 2 entries as well, Premature Burial is also on the limited list at 1 copy in Classic Yu-Gi-Oh! This is because Monster Reborn S cards are either banned or limited in Classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Reborn is usually banned, and Call the Haunted is also limited to 1 copy. The distinction between the two is that once the spell or trap card leaves the field, that special summon monster also says goodbye, unlike Monster Reborn. Regardless, Premature Burial is an insanely strong card for the Classic era, where special summoning monsters from your graveyard is just incredibly powerful. Your boss monster or key combo piece got destroyed, well, bring it back by paying a low cost of 800 life points, no conditions, no hassle, and you could even bounce it back to your hand with Giant Trunade to do it over again. Last but not least is Snatch Steal, which is arguably the best equipped spell card in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Probably because it doesn't even do what the typical equipped cards do. It's an offensive equipped card that targets a monster your opponent control and lets you take control of it, all for the low cost of giving your opponent 1,000 life points during each of their standby phases. Snatch Steal turns games around. There is so much utility in stealing your opponent's monster, from using it as a tribute for one of your monsters,
without having to pay the 1,000 life points,
and of course using it as your own to just attack your opponent. Which is why Snatch Steal is used in almost every single Classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck because of how it can turn a game around and its versatility. Just like in the current modern format, Snatch Steal is limited to 1, but for a time, Snatch Steal even spent time on the ban list. And for a time, I mean for a really long time. Even in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! With as many negates and protection effects out there, Snatch Steal is still on the limited list. Because even still in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, cards that take control of your opponent's monsters have heavy limitations on them. But we are talking about Classic Yu-Gi-Oh!
Snatch Steal has no limitations aside from
modern, and there are very
giving
few,
1,000 life
if no
points.
negates for a card like Snatch Steal, which only strengthens how good the card is, which is why Snatch Steal is hands down one of the best equipped spells in Classic Yu-Gi-Oh! For this video, we're calling the Classic era just any cards released before Synchros. And in this, we're going to look at some of the worst quick plays of these older cards. Starting us out at number 10, we have the Reliable Guardian. This quick play spell targets and raises the defense of a monster by 600 points until the end of this turn. Defense boosts are just not that good overall, even back when battle tricks were actually relevant. And this just happens to be the worst version of that effect. The reason why this card's attack counterpart, Rush Recklessly, actually saw some play is simply due to how combat mechanics line up in Yu-Gi-Oh! A defense boost will almost never allow you to trade up and remove an opponent's monster for using it. And while it may let you keep a monster around and do some damage to your opponent, you're always going -1 in the process. Though, there are cards that make it so that a higher defense monster will destroy an attacking one with less attack. That's still really underpowered for a 2-card combo though. The Reliable Guardian never even had a niche as the Rush Recklessly for monsters that can attack while in defense, because these all came out much after stat modifying effects were all that relevant. The truth is, there are just several better options you could be running to protect a defense position monster. There are many battle traps that also remove your opponent's monster while stopping the attack. And if you really want specifically battle protection, there are traps to protect your whole field instead. Even if you're a defense-focused deck filled with cards like Stone Statue of the Aztecs, which does double the damage an opponent takes when attacking into it, you'd be better off with cards that reduce your opponent's attack like Mirror Wall instead. If you look into the modern card pool, then we'll have the likes of Rise to Full Height and D2 Shield to double the monster's defense instead. This is just a really old card that was already outclassed in release, and much more now. And at number 9, we have Guard Penalty. This spell lets you target one monster on the field, and if it's changed to defense position this turn, draw a card. Just to get out of the way, you can only draw a single card with the spell, even if you somehow manage to change the monster's position multiple times. Now, drawing just a single card is already a valuable effect in of itself. Upstart Goblin has seen tons of play through all the ages of the game, and even its trap version, Jar of Greed, used to be viable in the past. So why is this card bad? Well, there's just a pretty big rift between a free draw one and a conditional one like this, no matter how easy the condition is. You need either a monster in the field that's already been there for a turn, or a card that changes battle position available. While that's not that hard
So
to
you
assemble,
need
it's infinitely times more difficult than other draw spells, which just need you to activate them. Not only that, but it also gives your opponent
it's just
an
kind of
avenue to
complicated to
interact
get it
turn one,
activated to
which
begin
could
with.
lead you to getting 2 for 1 easily. Think about it this way, no one's going to stop your Upstart Goblin. But if they see you activating guard penalty in one of your monsters, they might be very tempted to spend removal on it in response. It's quite hard to make a draw 1 effect be bad at Yu-Gi-Oh!, but this card manages to do so perfectly. And at number 8, we have Ring of Defense. This quick play spell
this
can be
one.
activated in response to the effect of a trap that would inflict damage. And it
This
makes
one
the
would work
effect
with Ring of
damage 0.
Destruction.
This card is obviously meant to be a counter to Burn, which was once a really feared strategy. The issue is that it just doesn't do its job very well. The first problem is that the best burn cards usually inflict damage while also doing other stuff, like Ring of Destruction popping the monster, or Magical Cylinder negating the attack, both of which would still have their effects go through after Ring of Defense. Additionally, many of the best burn cards are spells like Wave Motion Cannon or monsters like Death's Koala. If you wanted to actually counter burn, there are just so many better options you'd never think of slotting this card anywhere in a deck. Barrel Behind the Door can be used on spells, traps, and monsters, and not only does it cancel the damage you take, it also sends it back to your opponent. If you want to get around more than just one single trap, you can also just run Royal Decree instead as well, which could be used to beat a wide variety of decks too. At last, if your issue is that these previous 2 are trap cards that need to be set for a turn, there's always Death's Wombat, which straight up prevents you from ever taking effect damage while it's on the field, and only needs to be normal summon. As a narrow card made to counter a specific deck, it doesn't even do that well, and so was severely outclassed even back in 2004. And at number 7, we have Jar Robber. You can only activate this card in response to Pot of Greed, and then you negate it and draw a card. If there's one card you never want to see resolved on you, it's Pot of Greed. That easy +1 can swing the tide of almost any duel. No wonder then that Pot was banned all the way back in 2005, only to never come out of the Forbidden List again. This much would have already made Jar Robber into a card that's completely useless for the last 20 years, and will continue to be, as the card is never coming off the list. Still, even when Pot was legal, it was always limited to 1, meaning you weren't even guaranteed to see it throughout a duel. Not only that, but why bother playing a card that can only negate that, when at the time Pot was legal, you could also play Solemn Judgment at 3. Sure, there's a bit of a bigger upside in negating a Pot with Jar Robber, but it's so much better to have the flexibility to negate any other card too instead. That's always been the issue with these
Jar Robber is pretty much useless.
And why none of them ever saw play. Call of the Grave, Anti-Raigeki, White Hole, and Griffin Wing are all counterparts to Jar Robber for Monster Reborn, Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Harpy's Feather Duster instead. And odds are, you've seen a few of those in the worst of lists already. The only thing that separates Jar Robber from the rest of them is that it's a quick play spell instead of a trap, even if that doesn't make much sense, because it's not like your opponent is ever going to be activating a normal spell in your turn anyway. Pot of Greed might be one of the strongest cards in the GOAT format, but this is simply not a good way to beat it. And at number 6, we have Monster Recovery. This quick play spell targets a monster you control that is owned by you, and shuffles it and your entire hand into your deck, and then draws you cards equal to the number of cards shuffled from your hand by this effect. While getting access to what's essentially a mulligan has the potential to be a pretty good effect, letting you shuffle back your bricks and such, this card just makes you -2 way too hard to ever be worth it. Since you only get to draw a card for each card that was in your hand at the time, and need to get rid of one of your monsters to activate it, you're always going -2 for that effect. On top of that, the extra clause saying
So
it
it's
needs
not
to be a
worth the
monster that's
cost.
owned by you also prevents you from comboing this with steal effects like Mind Control. If you really wanted to refresh your hand, you could be running Card Destruction instead, which is just a -1 and lets you set up graveyard synergies as well. On top of that, if you go just a couple of years after this card was released, there'd be Reload, which is pretty much just the same card, but without needing to shuffle back one of your guys.
Reload's
the small
good.
added benefit of this card is supposed to be that you can chain it to monster removal, so that your monster won't get outed, but rather sent back to your deck, when you'd eventually be able to draw into it again. But this isn't even that good, as unless it's banish removal, monsters are generally more accessible from the graveyard than from the deck anyways. There are valid reasons to want an effect like this, and Card Destruction, Reload, and Magical Mallet have seen quite a bit of play due to it, but Monster Recovery is just so much worse than the rest of them that it's not even worth looking at. And at number 5, we have Soul Reversal. This card returns one flip monster from your graveyard to the top of your deck. Soul Reversal is one of the few ways to recycle flip monsters the game had back in the day. But just because it's unique,
But it goes to
doesn't
the
mean
top
it's
of your
good.
deck rather
Even
than
for
your
GOAT
hand.
format standards, having to go -1 to not even get the monster back during the same turn is just way too slow. If you're looking at this card as part of a 2-card combo with something that draws to let you reuse a strong limited monster like Magician of Faith, it's still pretty bad. It'd be way better to just figure out a way to discard a Night Assailant consistently instead. Even a deck that's super reliant on their flip monsters like Empty Jar would sooner run Shallow Grave, which summons the monster to the field instead. And even in these two cases where Soul Reversal is heavily outclassed, we are only looking at its contemporaries from way back in the day. By advancing just a bit further into the timeline, you get way better ways to get monsters from the graveyard back to the hand, like Monster Reincarnation and Drill Warrior, who can recover in non-flips too, and without waiting a turn for it. The only other use for Soul Reversal is comboing it together with cards that you need to call to the top of your deck, like Reversal Quiz and Arcfiend's Oath. But you can know what's there with much less setup involved with Convulsion of Nature instead. Getting a flip monster spun back to the top of your deck with Ryza or Phoenix Wing Windblast was always a soul-crushing move that set you back on tempo enough for you to lose the duel on the spot. And Soul Reversal lets you do just that, except to yourself and not your opponent. And at number 4, we have Bubble Shuffle. This spell targets a face-up attack position Elemental Hero Bubble Man you control, and an attack position monster your opponent controls, and changes both to defense position. Then you tribute your Bubble Man and special summon an Elemental Hero from your hand. This card asks for just a bit too much of you for what it gives off. As if leaving a specific monster in the field wasn't enough, it also wants your opponent to have an attack position one, and you need to have an Elemental Hero in hand to activate it as well. While Bubble Man is at least a leagues better than a lot of the other Elemental Heroes, and even packs a special summoning condition, it only began to see play once XCs became a thing. So it was never a monster you wanted to end on your side of the field. While an old school Elemental Hero deck would have lots of great targets to summon out, like Stratos and Alias, you could have just as well normal summoned them instead for almost the same value, since Bubble Man is getting tributed anyways. The way this card was meant to be used was showcased in the anime and manga, where Jaden used it to change an opponent's monster to defense position while cheating out Blade Edge, a 2600 attack beater with piercing. Needless to say, that was never nearly good enough to see play in the real game. The last thing hero decks wanted was a high level monster with no inherent special summoning condition, and if you just wanted to change your opponent's battle position at spell speed 2, Book of Moon could do so with much less hoops to jump through. Bubble Shuffle is a mess of a card, with strict activation requirements for an effect that's halfway between a battle trick and a way to cheat a monster out.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem useful in the long run.
At number 3, we have Photon Generator Unit. You must tribute 2 Cyber Dragons to activate this card, and then it lets you special summon a Cyber Laser Dragon from your hand deck or graveyard. Now, Cyber Laser Dragon is a level 7 with 2400 attack and 800 defense that cannot be normal summoned or set, and must be special summoned with Photon Generator Unit. Its effect is that, once per turn, you can target and destroy a monster on the field with an attack or defense equal or higher than this card's attack. This card requires way too much setup to get out a monster that's not even that good. Cyber Laser Dragon is a total brick if you ever draw it. Finds protection and has a stat line that's low enough for it to be matched by pretty much all single tribute monsters of its time. Though its effect is actually quite decent, it's still much worse than what a card like Chaos Sorcerer or Dark Arm Dragon would give you. And these two cards were also much easier to bring out to boot. While summoning out a single Cyber Dragon is really easy, to the point where we often call monsters that special summon out for free Cyber Dragons, getting 2 is a tad more annoying. Since its effects need you to have an empty field, you'll either need a way to cheat it out, or set up a tribute summon for the second one. It doesn't help that Cyber Dragon also quickly got semi-limited after its release, making it even less likely for you to draw into Bolt during a duel. And while you can use this card to tribute your Cyber Dragons in response to targeted removal and trade up, you're still only turning a -2 into a -1. Even in the best situations for Photon Generator Unit, where you manage to attack with both Cyber Dragons directly and then bring out their evolved form for a third attack all inside the battle phase, it's still not enough for a game. While if you had limited removal instead, it would be. Though with time, it'd eventually become trivial to have 2 Cyber Dragons out. You'd only get less reason to play Photon Generator Unit, as the same 2 Syndras meant Nova into Infinity and an Omni Negate. That much is a million times better than a mediocre boss monster this card wants you to run. And at number 2, we have Level Down, a quick play spell that targets a face-up
I forgot about this card.
Turns it to its owner's deck, and then special summons a monster from its owner's graveyard to the side of the field with the same name but a lower level, ignoring its summoning conditions. Level monsters were an early Yu-Gi-Oh gimmick where you'd have a monster that starts out weak but can level up and send themselves to the grave to summon out their higher leveled versions from your hand or deck once their summoning conditions were met. The dilemma with them is that their gimmick was just a little bit too clunky to ever work. While there have been some level monsters to see play, like the Dark Mimit and Mystical Swordsman level 2, the level up gimmick was more or less ignored entirely. This is a roundabout way of saying that there was never really any reason to play Level Down as a counter to the mechanic, since most of the time people were playing the lowest level version of the monster anyway. Even if there were better level monsters around, you'd be better off playing actual removal rather than just swapping out your opponent's body for another. Though this card can also be used to target your own monsters and have them dodge effects, Book of Moon and Forbidden Lance are easier ways to protect your monsters without needing to have their weaker counterparts in the graveyard. On top of all of that, this card can't even answer the most threatening level monsters we've ever had. Horus the Black Flame Dragons level 6 and level 8 were sometimes tacked into Dragon Ruler format because you could search 6 with Blaster and then tribute summon it. This would net you a spell immune monster that would be able to negate all opponent spells if it ever beat over something by battle. The key takeaway here being that neither 6 nor 8 would ever be vulnerable to level down, due to either being unaffected by spells or able to negate them. The only thing to go down with this card is the strength of whatever deck it's included in. And finally, at number 1, we have Mirage Tube. This quick play spell cannot be activated from your hand, and it must be activated when a face-up monster you control is targeted for an attack and inflicts 1000 damage to your opponent. It's only fitting, the worst quick play spell would be one in name only. The only thing that sets apart quick plays and traps is the former can be activated from the hand, something which this card's restriction stops completely. The most interesting part about this is having the restriction written on the card was completely pointless for several years, as its mechanic only really allowed you to use it during your opponent's turn, since they needed to declare an attack. Well, up until the release of Condemned Maidens in 2014 anyways, so talk about future-proof. Either way, this is just a really bad way of inflicting burn damage to your opponent, being outclassed by several other cards of the same niche. Tremendous Fire wasn't even that big of a staple in burn decks at the time, and even though it also burns you for a bit, it's pretty much always just a straight-up upgrade from this card. When you look at other effect damage options that also require your opponent to attack you, you both have Dimension Wall and Magic Cylinder, both of which do the job much better. Not only are they both inflicting much more on average, they also don't require you to control any monsters to be activated and stop you from taking any damage entirely, both huge upsides when compared to Mirage Tube. In the anime, this card's effect would instead negate the attack and inflict burn damage to your opponent equal to the attacked monsters, which makes the restriction make a bit more sense. That's a pretty clear side grade to Magic Cylinder, and the card's Japanese name, Mirage Cylinder, even reflects that. That's probably why they thought they couldn't bring the card to the TCG without some changes, where the original Cylinder was limited on the list at the time, and wouldn't leave the ban list until several years later after all. However, that didn't mean they needed to nerf it this hard and make it into one of the worst quick plays ever instead. If even Jaden didn't have a card as bad as this in his deck, no one should ever have it in theirs either. And starting us out at number 10, we have Shrink. This quick play spell targets a face-up monster in the field and
top 10 battle tricks. Okay.
This turn. Shrink is probably one of the first cards to come to anyone's mind when they hear the word battle trick. It will always allow reasonably statted monsters to win pretty much every battle, and can be used both when attacking and being attacked. One of the biggest upsides of this over something like Sakuretsu Armor is that it can be activated during the damage step, where most kinds of effects cannot be activated, letting it get under a lot of usual defensive options. Shrink single-handedly power crept Rush recklessly, which increased a monster's attack by 700. And replaced it entirely in all decks that wanted to run the card. At the time of its release, that was most commonly Gadgets, because they had just enough attack to trade with 1 tribute monsters after a Shrink. It was yet another piece of 1-for-1 removal in a deck that really maxed out on these. Shortly afterwards, it became a staple in Gladiator Beast decks, as their monsters all needed to have battled that turn to activate their effects, meaning that battle traps that removed monsters or negated attacks were just not that good. For that reason, many lists would opt to run cards like Shrink and Waboku instead, which made it extra dangerous for your opponent to attack into your monsters, as you'd then be able to use the tag out Glads during your opponent's battle phase too. And this is kind of where Shrink's usage ended. There wasn't really any deck after Gladiator Beasts that would be better off using other battle traps, and even in there, players would eventually prefer to run more versatile back row, like Bottomless Trap Hole or Compulsory Evacuation Device. Not that big of a showing for Shrink, but that's just how we're going to start this list out. And coming in number 9, we have Necro Gardna. This is a level 3 Dark Warrior that, as a quick effect, can banish itself during your opponent's turn to negate their next attack. Gardna was the first good battle stopper activatable straight from your graveyard, and one of the first good generic graveyard effects we got in the game overall. This card would go on to be played on all sorts of mill and graveyard-centered decks for the foreseeable future, to the point where it was even limited on the ban list for a while. Dark Toolbox decks centered around Dark Arm Dragon would play it, since Dark Grepher and Armageddon Knight are both really easy ways to send it straight from the deck to the graveyard. Lightsworns loved it as well because all their monsters ended up milling for you for some amount. letting you sometimes get a free Gardna out in the graveyard. While yes, differently from a set back row, your opponent can see the Necro Gardna and play around it better than some unknown face down card, having it available almost for free without being vulnerable to removal more than made up for it though. And while they can see it's there, you'll still need to field multiple attacks to really make up for it. Old decks often would not have enough swarming power to flood a board just like that, making it very effective at protecting small monsters, especially in the early game. It also pretty much guarantees you won't die in a given turn, since you can always cancel the strongest attack your opponent has going through. Gardna was a deceptively strong part of any mill deck all the way until 2015. When Electromagnetic Turtle came out, which banishes itself from the graveyard to end your opponent's battle phase instead. Still,
Which is
despite
better.
being power crept eventually, it's still a huge achievement that Gardna saw play for as long as it did. And now for number 8, there's Threatening Roar. This normal trap makes it so that your opponent cannot declare an attack this turn. Out of all the cards in this list, none of them are better at stopping an OTK from going through than Threatening Roar. It's chainable,
Yeah,
meaning
that's
that back row
pretty good
removal
for
won't stop its
stopping an
effect from
attack.
going off, and just blanket protects you for a whole turn. It's also very much similar to the older Wabaku, except it has the upsides of making your opponent unable to trigger effects that can only happen during attacks. Threatening Roar saw a lot of play in old explosive formats, such as Tier 0 Dad and Inzectors. While these decks could kill you very easily, they couldn't really build a board to stop you from playing on your following turn. So skipping their battle phase was a great way to do a reversal and OTK them instead. Later on, it'd also become a decent option in Paleozoics as a chainable trap card that both keeps you and your Paleos alive. Threatening Roar has even been seen a small amount of play in the modern format as something you can tutor from Thrust and Trap Trick against Tenpai Dragon. Tenpai functions much like old school OTK decks in that it's really good at killing you in one turn, but sucks at making a board of its own, making this a pretty valid option. Against a deck that can deal upwards of 36,000 damage during the battle phase, anything short
Ooh.
of stopping them from attacking entirely is just not going to be enough. And at number 7, we have Magic Cylinder.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
one
the
of my
trap that
favorites.
targets an opponent's attacking monster, negates
God,
the
I
attack,
still have
and
my
then
original
inflicts
copy of
damage
this
to your
card.
opponent equal to that monster's attack. As far as being a battle trick goes, Magic Cylinder is quite mediocre. I mean, yeah, it deals with the attack, but it doesn't really deal with the monster, meaning next turn, they'll be ready to bash you with it again. However, Cylinder excels at being a burn card, and one of the best game enders that burn decks can have access to. Back in classic Yu-Gi-Oh!, you'd even see this card being ran in non-burn decks as a very cheesy way of ending games. You get into a grind game with an opponent, and then they'd finally get the upper hand and manage to establish a big monster, only for you to get surprised and get KO'd by this instead. The inherent sackiness
hilarious.
this card had made it very much like Ring of Destruction back in the day, something that could turn a one game into a loss by itself. Konami would handle it accordingly then and limit Cylinder to 1 for a really long time.
Which
Once
is
the
fair.
card pool widened a bit and we got better and better things to use during the battle phase, Cylinder would be mostly confined to decks like Chainburn. In the future, it even gets some legacy support with Magic Cylinders, a card which both sets it from the deck and doubles the damage it does, though it also kind of defeats the point of the card if your opponent knows you have one set. And even if it might not be the scariest game ender it once was, you've probably been hit by a Cylinder at least once if you've climbed the Master Duel ladder. And at number 6, there's Enemy Controller. This is a quick play spell. that
Ooh,
lets you
Enemy
choose
Controller is a
between two
fun one.
effects. Either target an opponent's monster and change its battle position, or tribute one of your monsters to take control of an opponent's monster until the end of the turn. Econ was one of the first modal spells the game saw, and it was a pretty good one at that. Either of its effects wouldn't really be good enough to see play individually, but when you have access to both, you get one of the most versatile cards the game has ever seen. It is true that the first effect, the one that actually qualifies as a battle trick, was always seen as the worst one. Still, that doesn't mean it couldn't be useful at times. One, if its best uses was changing monarchs to defense position, as their paltry 1000 defense would allow them to get beaten over by basically anything. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It can also be used as a last resort to stop a Zeus play from happening. But yeah, the meat and bones of Econ was definitely the steal effect. The original combo was to tribute a Treeborn Frog in the standby phase to take an opponent's monster, and since Treeborn Frog was not a hard once per turn, it would just come right back again. This lets you set up
Yeah,
other
that's
tributes
pretty
while also
cheeky.
removing an opponent's monster, which is a massive tempo swing. There's just a lot of value in stealing an opponent's monster, especially when the tribute cost lets you dodge all kinds of targeted removal and negation effects. This let the card see play in decks such as BA, Zodiacs, and even Kashtira. While it never got hit in the TCG, it saw enough play in Duel Links to be limited 2 for several years, and even got put down to 1 in recent times. However, while Econ might be one of the most popular cards in here, only qualifying due to its consolation effect has knocked it down a peg on this list. And at number 5, we have Sakuretsu Army.
Okay.
This normal trap can be...
So I think here is where I'm going to stop for the day. Made it through another 11 days. Now we're up to 23. And I expanded the store a little earlier than I thought. But I did get a bunch of extra stuff in here, including new card set and the card table here. What is this thing called again? The workbench. Yeah, to just sell bulk. But yeah, again, making really good progress here. It's shaping up to be a nice little store. I'll definitely have to buy another table to make 6, so yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what goal I'm going to have for next time I do this. It'll be something, I don't know what. But yeah, I think that'll do it for me today. Happy to continue playing this game, and hopefully a new update will come out soon-ish. I don't know when. But yeah, still looking forward to more of this. But with that, thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you all later. Bye!